Welcome to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. I am glad that you guys can join me on this episode 33, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm glad you could join me. It's early morning. I think I always say it's early morning because I don't necessarily sleep that great. And yet I am still here nonetheless doing the news with you on the best damn morning show in the history of morning shows. I hope you guys are doing okay this morning. There is a lot of news, a lot of interesting news, and it makes it difficult to come up with a title when there is that much interesting news. And so if you guys have ideas on the title for something like this, let me know in the comments, but we are going to keep this boat rocking. The French government has collapsed. It has fallen. The sun has fallen on the French government. They've earned this, by the way. So feel nothing for this. If anything, feel a certain amount of applause for my ability to predict that none of this stuff was going to work. When I had the opportunity to go over into Europe in order to cover the European elections, you had the situation where many of the parties that were pro-war parties lost. And you saw a shift to the right, because it was the right-wing parties that was calling into question what was taking place, what was being done, and whether or not it was a good idea to keep the policies. All right, Europe blew off the fact that those elections took place. But in France had a different response. Macron's Renaissance Party lost, and it lost badly. And it lost to the National Rally Party of Marine Le Pen. Now, okay, well, France can't tolerate this. This is completely humiliating. So Macron turns around and says, we need elections. We need elections now. And he dissolves the parliament with this idea of showing France is not going the way of Marine Le Pen. That was his point. That was his objective. And he has those elections, and the National Rally wins. His party comes in a distant third. Okay, so this is somewhat of a problem. So then they go at the secondary elections, because of the first round, second round. And in the second round, there's a huge amount of horse trading to try to keep the National Rally from winning. In that horse trading, the group of left-wing parties win. The group of left-wing parties win. So what does Macron do with this? The left-wing parties won. His party comes in a distant third. He himself is completely, utterly, fantastically despised. So certainly he has to put in the winners into parliament, into power. What Macron does was choose Michael Barnier, somebody who he likes, but wasn't elected by anybody. This was effectively a coup. And I remember being at work where my boss thought it was comical because I was like, what the hell? This is a coup. How is he doing this? How do you continuously lose an election? And your response to that loss is, I'm still going to put somebody who I like into that position. So, okay, fair enough. He does that. Barnier gets in. This is Barnier begging for his job yesterday before he lost his job, and he was fired by Parliament in a no confidence vote.
What I'm sure of, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm saying with all seriousness in front of you is that this motion of no confidence will make everything more serious and more difficult.
Sacre bleu! Sacre bleu! Sacre bleu! Don't take me out of office. Don't take me out of office, bro. Okay, well, they didn't pay attention to that. They voted him out. The French government has fallen. So now the question becomes, okay, now what do? You had your elections. You failed in those. You put in your guy in this kind of mini coup. failed in that. So now what? Now what? I don't have an answer for that. I'm hoping my guests will. But the French government, as we know it, is no more. They voted him out in a no confidence vote. In other news, items that are taking place, we have the Syrian conflict that is still going on, of course, where a bunch of jihadis are dumped into Syria, backed by Turkey and the United States. That is taking place. That is heartbreaking, by the way. There is a fascinating conversation that needs to take place regarding nuance. And not just nuance, looking at international players, oftentimes it's a situation of least worseness, meaning the guy is not necessarily great, but what they're doing is far worse. Let's take Saddam Hussein, for example. Saddam Hussein was brutal by any stretch of the imagination. A vicious, brutal man. We had no issue working with that vicious, brutal man when he was serving our intentions. We had no issue working with him at all. We have no issue working with dictators in general. Saddam Hussein ran afoul, eventually, of our policy, and we got rid of him because of such. What happened to Iraq was horrific. We got over 1 million Iraqis killed in attacking that country under this pretext of weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist, that George Bush pushed the country into. But that doesn't make Saddam Hussein a lovely, cuddly man, if that makes sense. Meaning both things can be true. It can be true that, yeah, he's a horrible person. By the same token, him being a horrible person doesn't mean you get 1 million people killed to remove that horrible person. That is a worse outcome. I'm saying the same thing is true for Syria in some way. I don't have to make Assad look like love and light in order to say that an invasion of that country by head choppers who are killing women and children. I can show you a video of them chopping off the head of a child. This is what we are paying for. This is what we are backing. I don't care what Assad is. That is radically worse. That is radically, radically worse. And to make that clear, Assad has opposition. There are people in the country that may hate his guts. By the same token, those same people are not going to be okay with head choppers invading the country and killing women and children, old men, and regular guys who want no part of this. Meaning the guy who's cutting hair in Syria doesn't want head choppers coming into his country, regardless of what that guy thinks about Assad. And I'm saying this to say that sometimes people try to make the person who is at the bad end virtuous. They don't need to be virtuous. I very rarely do you hear me make an argument for a world leader being this great person. I don't think I've ever done that in the way I'm talking about it. Very few world leaders, but usually those are really decent people in general. When I am typically talking about international relations, I am talking about it from a standpoint of whether it's okay, whether we should, what is the outcome, how does it affect regular people? And oftentimes, regardless of the person who's in that position of authority, it is secondary to the point that we and what we are doing is purely for our own self-interest, and we're using that as a justification to get a lot of people killed, slaughtered, wiped off the face of the earth. And we would come, oh, they're going to see us as liberators and blah, blah, blah. When we send those democratic-loving head choppers into the country, those, pro-democracy terrorists, when they go into the country, people are going to love them. No, they're not. They're not. I promise you, they're not. They're not. We're okay with those head choppers going in and killing and taking over the government, because then we can go in and kill the head choppers, because nobody's going to want head choppers to be leading a government. I'm saying it's the way we do a foreign policy. And by the way, when the coup was taking place yesterday in North Korea, and it was a coup, call it, when Yoon comes out, president of South Korea, and says, this is now a dictatorship, no media, no free association, meaning no groups, no crowds, no parliament, no national assembly. You will not be able to go and rally and even evaluate my order. Okay, well, I didn't hear America say anything. Meaning as a democracy was being destroyed. The US, because it's so close to South Korea, had nothing to say. Okay, that's interesting. They said something after, but as it was taking place, nothing in those 6 hours. All right, fast forward to Syria, where you have head choppers. Okay, we're backing that. That's okay. Move over to Georgia, where you have Maidan 2.0 with heavy pressure against the Georgian government that they are trying to overthrow. And to make that clear, this is one of the speeches, what is that name, Rutt? And in that speech, he was pushing this idea that the only way that they can really be a democracy is for it to go into NATO or into the EU. And this is outrageous. Effectively saying, yeah, I know you guys have your point of view and all. And keep in mind, this is while they are putting extreme pressure. You have European leaders going in Georgia backing violent protests, just like you did in Ukraine. And of course, the European leaders are going to come back and say, these are peaceful protests, despite the fact they're shooting cannons at Parliament. If I'm not mistaken, even set Parliament on fire. This is in Georgia. These freedom-loving, pro-democracy, fire-setting protesters. They love democracy that much, where they are attacking the parliamentary building. But we have nothing to say about that. We have nothing to say about that, short of attacking the Georgian government. I want to bring in my guests. We are joined with the one and only man of the hour, the man I go to get a workable point of view of what the hell is happening on the ground, Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, man, I'm so happy to talk to you. How you doing this morning? You doing all right?
Tomorrow, I'm alive, and I object to being labeled as the man of the 7:15 a.m. hour because that's an ungodly hour.
It is an ungodly hour.
Your time.
I drag my ass out every morning at this time, and it's painful some mornings. This is one of those mornings that's painful. But I'm glad you could join me either way in this ungodly hour. There is so much news taking place around the globe, and I have to start at Syria, I suppose. A group of jihadis, head choppers, all at once invade Syria, taking a conflict that was frozen.
A group is perhaps an understatement.
Well, they were like an army. I mean, for all intents and purposes.
Horde.
I mean, they had tanks, U.S. vehicles, all sorts of equipment, even Ukrainian drone operators, apparently, or trained by Ukrainian drone operators.
I would say trained.
Yeah, so they had a force. I've asked this question once before. I'm going to ask you, how did Russia, Syria, and Iran not know, see, get intelligence on this massive force being accrued in order to invade? I'm still in the dark about that. I mean, is it the Astana agreements where they thought, okay, well, we have an agreement, so no issue? What happened with this?
Yeah, they effed up big time. They seriously effed up. I mean, it is a big cluster F.
Yeah.
Obviously, Russia has a much smaller imprint on the ground, or did a week ago anyway, than they did back in 2015 through 2020. Obviously, Russia still has several air bases, one less now, at least, than they did before. They have the Tartus naval base, but the number of Russian troops actually in the country is or was until a week ago fairly small. My understanding now is that that number is rapidly being pumped up, and that a significant amount of the new troops being sent in are either Wagner or former Wagner or used to identify as Wagner, however you want to term that. But obviously, I mean, the biggest failure, of course, is on the Syrian military and military intelligence that they did not see us. Now, I personally know Syrian analysts who have been warning about this for months.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Right. So, how it must have been not willing to see what was coming, in part because of agreements under the quote Astana format, quote unquote, i.e., a frozen conflict deal that was cut with Erdogan. Because this is Erdogan. Let's make that clear. The Russian media, particularly the state media, anyway, is dancing completely around this, right? Because the Russian government is not acknowledging it as part of their, I guess, strategy for dealing with it. Now, obviously, the U.S. has their role, right? Obviously, they were whispering in Erdogan's ear, encouraging him, providing support. They've been providing air cover for Al-Qaeda. They've been strafing the columns of Iraqi popular mobilization units backed by Iran that have been pouring into the country. These are the same popular mobilization units that were instrumental, even the U.S. admitted at the time, instrumental in driving back ISIS in Iraq, right? They were the ground component that did it when the NATO trained Iraqi army turned tail and ran. These popular mobilization units coming into Syria to deal literally with Al-Qaeda. Let's make that clear. The biggest group involved in this, the organizing group, is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which even the United States admits is Al-Qaeda and a terrorist group, right? Even the United States admits that. But the U.S. is openly providing air cover for Al-Qaeda now by strafing these Iraqi popular mobilization units that are coming in to deal. So obviously the U.S. is deeply involved in this. And we know that the Kiev regime is involved because they've definitely provided some drone training and other training to these jihadis. We've received word of that already in the Western press. The Kiev Post came out with a piece earlier this week openly saying, yeah, our guys were providing drone training to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which, by the way, is Al-Qaeda, right? And outright admitted that, right? But that's no surprise because these jihadis have been fighting for the Kiev regime going back to 2015, right? And this has also been reported on in the Western media. The Sheikh Mansour Battalion, the Dudayev Battalion, openly admitted in press, in the Daily Beast back in 2017 or 2019, Anna Nemtsova. Yeah, they got their training with ISIS, and now they're fighting for the Kiev regime, right? Openly admitted. They did photo op luncheons. Former ISIS jihadis having a sit-down photo lunch with the neo-Nazi Banderite fascists of the right sector, right? I mean, that's how open this exchange between Kiev has been. But still, that's on the small, and it has to be. This is Erdogan. 98, 97, 98%. This is Erdogan. And Erdogan is obviously miffed, peeved, right? He cut a deal with that froze the conflict back in 2019, 2020. And that left him in control of large swaths, basically the entire north of Syria, up to 30 kilometers deep, which Turkish forces, along with what used to be called the Free Syrian Army and a bunch of other groups that were melded together. Now they call it the Syrian National Army, the SNA. And that's somewhere between around 80 to 100,000 jihadis and Islamists under arms, right? On Turkish payrolls that are loyal to Erdogan in occupied Syrian territory. And then, somewhat discrete from that, is what had previously just been contained to northern Idlib, and that's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the rest of the 31 flavors of jihad that, for various PR reasons, couldn't be folded into the Syrian National Army, like the Turkestan Islamic Party and others. And they're taking the big share of this, of the credit, but the forces of the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, the Islamists, are also participating in this. And it has to be said, Turkish regular troops are participating in this. They're providing artillery cover, right, for these troops, right? Erdogan is peeved that no political reconciliation has occurred, right, that would basically grant him effective control of northern Syria, which would be devolved into an autonomous Sunni Islamist region that ultimately owed more fealty to Turkey, to Erdogan personally, than it did to Damascus, right? Because it would be all the opponents, all the Sunni Islamists and jihadists, right? That would nominally be still part of Syria, but the officiated, they would actually be de facto Turkish. This is what he wanted. He wanted officiation of this. And part of the reason why is there are still several million Syrian refugees in Turkey. And these refugees are, by and large, the families and sundry of these Islamists and jihadists. And the one thing that the entire Turkish political spectrum agrees on is they hate these refugees. They want them gone. Yeah. They're a big drag on the Turkish economy. They're taking low-wage jobs, driving down wages for everyone. They're deeply involved in crime and all sorts of things. So everyone wants them gone. They want to resettle them, right? A lot of this territory, you have to remember, was previously territory of Kurdish people, right? They've been driven out. And what Erdogan wants to do is receive officiation for resettling other, a mono-ethno-religious bloc, i.e. Sunni Islamists and jihadists and their kin, under his de facto control in northern Syria. And he wasn't getting this. And he's been extremely pissed off about this. He's been seething, and it's costing him politically at home. And he sees an opportunity here. Russia is still distracted in Ukraine, but it looks like it might at some point be coming to an end. So there's still a window of opportunity to act, but he felt he better act now. Iran has a president who seems who, at least when he took office, wanted to improve relations with the West, right, and seems adverse to escalation in Lebanon and Israel, right? And Hezbollah just got, the snot kicked out of it, right? They survived, but their entire political and military leadership was decapitated.
Yeah.
And they were forced, they still fought Israeli forces to a draw in southern Lebanon, which by any standard should be considered a victory, right? Because of the power imbalance and what they went in with. Israel said they were going to, wipe Hezbollah out, and they were going to drive them past the river. And all Hezbollah had to do was survive. And they did that, right? And so that's a victory for them, but they're still in a very bad state. They had to accept a ceasefire that they said they would never accept while Gaza was still undergoing a genocide by Israel. They've accepted that. And Israel has, and CNN admitted the other day that that Israel has violated the ceasefire a couple days ago already 100 times. Which seems to me that it then probably exists more in the violation than it does in the actual ceasefire category.
Right.
But Hezbollah, which had been an ally, right, and a big part of the anti-Salafist jihadist, regime change attempt in Syria the first time around, they're in a sorry state too. So all of this led up to a situation where Erdogan sees a window of opportunity. He senses weakness and distraction among his opponents, because that's what Russia and Iran are, right? This is really hard for people to get their heads around.
I mean, because it puts me in mind of frenemies more than opponents.
Yeah. So Russia and Iran and Turkey, they have agreed that they are going to have economic relations and strengthened economic relations. Russia and Turkey have great economic relations that continue to grow. Same thing with Iran and Turkey, that they will keep separate from their geopolitical differences, right? Which is hard for Westerners to get their head around, because they go to war with someone, they sanction, they cut off all trade, they sanction your mother and your mother's grandchildren, everyone, right? Down to the 7th generation and anyone who ever knew you in high school, right? This is a way of managing things. They very much want to avoid direct war between them, because they realize how bad that would be for everyone. But they have inescapable geopolitical differences in conflicts in Syria, in Libya, and Armenia, Azerbaijan. Right, all three of these countries, Iran not so much in Libya, but other than that, it's very much a thing. So, and here's the problem, though, is because while Russia and Iran have been observing this deal of this separation passively, i.e., they haven't been escalating any of these conflicts. They've simply been dealing with the Turks and the Turkish proxies, and then trying to tamp things down. Erdogan, on the other hand, has been observing this in the aggressive sense, right? Well, if things are separated, then I can just go to town with me and all my jihadi pets, right? That's his interpretation of this separation of the geopolitical and the economic. And that's what he's decided to do now, again, right? And he is a cunning and treacherous beast. He is, at his core, he is a bit of a pragmatist, right? But you have to know his background. He is an Islamist. He comes from a Sunni Islamist family and political background. And that is very much drives him, his mentality, his worldview to a very high degree. He sees Al-Qaeda as, drinking buddies, whereas he sees the Kurds as terrorists. Now, most of the rest of the world, right, Russia, even the U.S. to a degree, sees things to some degree the other way, other than, of course, Jake, Al-Qaeda is our ally in Syria, Sullivan. Right. But at least the common American people, right, recognize Al-Qaeda as an enemy. And the Kurds, well, they're okay. They're kind of secular. They They got decent, or role for women in their society. Yeah, they were a bit lefty and communist back in the Cold War, but they're over that now, apparently. That is when Russia and Iran and Turkey both talk about dealing with terrorism and Syrian territorial integrity. They mean completely different realities, right? When Russia and Iran refer to terrorists, they refer to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the other 31 flavors of jihad, and the Syrian National Army that are proxies of Turkey. Meanwhile, Turkey means the Kurds. When they talk about Syrian territorial integrity, yeah, Turkey wants Syrian territorial integrity. Right. With Assad gone, preferably, right? I mean, right? Under some type of Turkish control, right? Or Damascus agrees to Turkish de facto fealty over northern Syria. Well, that's the language that you have to be careful. So Putin held a conversation with Erdogan like 2 days before this kicked off. Right. Where they supposedly talked about economic matters. And it'd be very curious to know whether Erdogan actually hinted about this and this was discussed. It doesn't seem to be the case.
Right.
And if they didn't, and Erdogan just talked to Putin and then kicked off another jihad against Syria, where Russian military bases are located, then obviously you can imagine that Putin is pretty pissed. Now they just talked again.
Imagine he would be apoplectic. Yeah.
Yes. In the last 48 hours.
They talked a few days, exactly. I would love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. Man.
Here's the thing. Russia is pretending that Turkey is not involved.
Oh, that is. I mean, I've read through the conversation, and Putin said something to the effect of territorial integrity. We need to work, but there was veiled, pointed pushes to this idea of, dude, we need you to get these, like you say, your pets in line, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. And Turkey is acting like we have nothing to do with this. We believe that, and then I think the Khan though is the jig is up when he says, they need to listen to the Syrian people. Okay, I just watched those quote unquote Syrian people that Erdogan is talking about chop the head off of a child.
Yeah. So and large numbers of these Syrian people are jihadists from around the world.
Exactly.
Right. These particularly the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Turkestan Islamic Party bunch, right? I would say they're not really many Syrians among their ranks, right? This is an international Salafist jihad, horde supported by Erdogan, right?
That's my point. The jig was up when he said the quote unquote Syrian people. Yeah.
Yeah. So now there are Syrians, but they are Sunni Islamists who do not like for whatever flaws, and there are many flaws in the Syrian Arab Republic, right? Mm-hmm. But they are a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic country, right? With Shias and Druze, Alawites, right? That's if you want to say the ruling minority, but Sunnis who aren't Islamists, which actually make up the greater part of the population, right? And who don't want to live under this interpretation of Sunni Islam,
exactly,
right? And Kurds and others, but they want a Sunni Islamic caliphate, right? For just a different variation of what ISIS was intended to be. Exactly. However much the State Department may have coached them to say different things, they're nominal political leaders that have nothing to do with the actual jihadists on the ground. We saw that during the first one. But Russian state media is playing see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil about Turkey. On RT, actually had an article last week by a supposed Turkish geopolitical analyst from some center in Turkey who talked that Putin and Erdogan and Pezeshkian would be fighting together against Al-Qaeda. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I mean, either you are a complete moron, or this is the most shameless propaganda that for some reason RT is replicating as part of their, this is Putin. They're trying to give Erdogan an
political space, right?
An exit ramp, right? You can separate yourself from this, right? This is part of that management, that separation of the economic and geopolitical. And because Erdogan keeps saying, "What, we have nothing to do with it. It's all Assad." If he had just agreed to political reconciliation with the legitimate Syrian opposition, then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the other 31 flavors of jihad, which somehow are conflated with the legitimate opposition, would not have a thing.
Exactly my point. Right.
It's pure jihadi blackmail, right? And this is what this to me is completely unacceptable. I know there are people. Obviously, the Russian government is prepared to drive this back at whatever cost, right? Russia and Iran and Iraq working together with the Syrian government. And then, but they obviously intend to freeze the thing again and to cut another deal with Erdogan, because Erdogan knows what an important geopolitical pivot point Turkey is between NATO at the West and Russia, between the Middle East, between Sunni and Shia factions, everything. He's at the middle and the important swing one way or the other. Russia can't afford to go to war with Turkey. Turkey controls the access to the Black Sea. The last thing Russia needs is dozens of US and British and French warships in the Black Sea, right?
Okay, so they're stuck with this, meaning, because my first thought was, okay, well, is this a mistake? Is this one of those things where Syria can finally reunify or bring Idlib back into?
Not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Yeah.
Not going to happen. Not going to happen. And the U.S. is still camped out in East Syria, militarily occupying Syria's oil and wheat fields, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the heart of the Syrian economy, or was at one point, right? And that has played a big part in the hollowing out of Syria, and thus the Syrian military, right? The salary of a Syrian officer, right? You'd be lucky if you can buy a shawarma with it, right? A monthly salary, right? That's how bad things are in Syria. Very bad economically. And there has also been reports, which seem to be pretty credible, that this was planned months in advance, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, the U.S. helped getting the gear and the arms there. Yeah. It seems they infiltrated jihadis into Aleppo weeks beforehand, and they were already on the ground to sow the chaos that led to the Syrian army either retreating or just abandoning their positions. Take your pick of the interpretation there out of Aleppo. But remember, in the first Syrian conflict, half of Aleppo never fell to the jihadists, right? Half of Aleppo was always in Syrian government hands, right? Not anymore, right? The citadel of Aleppo never fell in the first conflict, and that's already gone. And the Syrian army obviously is regrouping and has initially managed to hold them back from Homs, but they're pressing hard now. And the Russian Air Force is working essentially 24/7, just bombing and bombing and bombing jihadis as they attempt to storm Homs. Now, whether they can hold them back at this point, I've heard various things of how many are actually involved in this, right? But what polls they have available is there are somewhere between 80 to 100,000 Islamists, jihadis in the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army. And in Idlib, right, or now it's more than Idlib, right? This little caliphate there. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has somewhere around 25 to 30,000, and if you add up the Turkestan Islamic Party and all the other 31 flavors that live under their umbrella there, you're probably talking close to another 50,000. So that's 150,000 Islamists and jihadists. And I've been warning about this on your show and elsewhere, that this is a frozen conflict, but it's just frozen. And all of this problem is still there. And now it's been unleashed. And it's a big problem.
That many people, like when we were talking about the Ukrainian war, for example, when there's a large group of people, you can see it by satellite, you can see it by intelligence, like it's hard to hide 200,000 people, let alone 200,000 jihadis that are just across the border waiting. I mean, they were talking about this on Telegram, apparently.
Yeah.
Some of the shows have been talking about it, saying, hey, there's going to be an attack. There's going to be an attack. So it just blows me away that they were caught.
Did they trust Erdogan? The Russian general who was in charge of Syria is already gone. He's been replaced, right? And the guy who replaced him is the general who was in Syria at the time when Russia and Turkey actually had direct conflict. And some 50 to 100 Turkish soldiers were killed. Regular soldiers, not their proxies.
Yeah.
Things are very tense there.
Well, how much force can Russia muster and pull from Ukraine in order to try to hold back?
That's a very good question. Yeah. So the Russian army is quite obviously much bigger, stronger, and more experienced than it was in 2015 to 2020. It's a completely different monster now. On the other hand, they're having to deal with the Kiev regime and essentially all of NATO in Ukraine, right?
Exactly.
And they have to worry about other potential flashpoints in Georgia and other places, right now. And there have been all kinds of weird things going on around Estonia and Finland with occasional drone attacks up there into Russian territory. So they can't take.
Wait. I had never heard of that one.
This was a couple months ago. I think we discussed it on your show, actually, right? Okay. And we were talking about how did Ukraine do an attack in Murmansk, a drone attack in Murmansk, right? You remember that, right? So but that was almost certainly out of Finland, right? So Russia has a lot more resources, but they can't afford to use. So right now, my understanding, they're sending Wagner, they're sending some of Russia's best drone operators, that sort of thing. Obviously, they'll be sending more air assets, multiple launch rocket systems, and the like. But they'll probably play the same role they did in the first conflict, right? Their primary goal will be organization, air power, intelligence, and that. The heavy lifting on the ground is going to have to be done by these Iranian-backed Iraqi popular mobilization units and potentially Iranian troops, because officially Iran has put out in the last 48 that they are willing to send official Iranian troops to Syria if the Syrian government requests them. So that's probably in part a warning to Turkey. Now, my understanding is that the Iranian foreign minister spoke with Erdogan also in the last 48, have been much more open, right? If Russia and Iran are the good cop and bad cop routine with Erdogan, then Iran is the bad cop. So evidently there were some heated words there. But this is a bad situation. And neither Russia nor Iran can afford to have Turkey officially join the opposition to them in the larger geopolitical sense. They want to keep this isolated to this is a disagreement in Syria and it shouldn't affect anything else, which is madness, of course, to a degree, but it's madness that also makes sense in the weird world of realist geopolitics.
Yeah, there's a logic to it.
But
God,
I mean, certainly, I want this SOB put down, right? I hate Erdogan, right? I hate Erdogan more than I hate the Banderites in Ukraine because he's so treacherous. You know, at least the Banderites are usually open about their hatred.
Yeah, you're clear.
There's going to be an attempt to appease him again. And I think that's the wrong tactic. I think that this has to be put down hard. I think Idlib should have been cleared out the first time.
Yes.
Right? And all of that, if they want to live in an Islamist state, there's one right up there in the north, right? It's Turkey. It's right up in front of you.
Go to Turkey.
If you want to live that kind of lifestyle.
Because now they're in a situation where, like you said, they can't get on Erdogan's bad side because of the other political stuff going on with NATO. By the same token, you don't necessarily, you can't have these jihadis setting up shop on your border. Yeah. They're not, because at that point you have another frozen conflict that could be reignited on a whim, just like it is now.
Here's the reality is that 30 to 35% of the Syrian population are Sunni Islamists and jihadis, or are susceptible to it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not what do you do when a third of your now, a greater part is normal Sunnis, right? Separate from the political religious ideology of Islamism, and that is obviously hand in hand with the Salafism, you know. Mm-hmm. So what do you do? And whenever they have control of that area, like Idlib and all of northern Syria, all of the next generation there is being raised as Islamist cannon fodder, right? The ones fighting now, large numbers of them were kids.
Yeah.
5-6 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Now they're fighters, right? So they're already breeding the next generation of anti-Syrian, anti-Russian, anti-Iranian jihadis.
So what are they going to do? Meaning, like you say, they're going to cut a deal. Okay, but what is that going to mean? For one, I guess, do you think Iran is going to get involved? Do you think that Putin is thinking we cannot continuously have this situation blowing up over and over and over again? We need to resolve this.
They're going to ask Assad to compromise with Erdogan.
Now, what does compromise mean in this case?
There's going to be an autonomous Sunni Islamist part of Syria in the north that is de facto under Turkish. Erdogan is going to get what he wants.
That is untenable. The reason I said it's untenable is because consider it now. They were able to take Idlib. All right. If this goes through, 10, 15 years after taking Idlib, now they've expanded to Aleppo?
Well, they're going to be driven out of Aleppo, right? They will not accept Aleppo being controlled. But north of Aleppo. Don't expect
it now. In 10, 15 years again. Another push.
It will, right?
That's my point.
Look how close this border is to Russia's border. It's 24 hours by Jeep from a point of Syria to the Russian Southern Caucasus. And large numbers of these jihadis in Idlib are Chechen, Ingush, Dagestani, and also from the Central Asian that are Salafists, right? They hate Ramzan Kadyrov and the Chechens in control of Chechnya. So they will be breeding another expat army of Caucasus jihadis in Idlib. And they've been breeding, they've been participating in Ukraine. Now they're fighting again in Syria. They're not going to go away. And their principle, right, is Russia hatred, right? Everything else to the side, right? These Salafists that have been largely driven out of the Caucasus into Idlib and participating in Ukraine, this is a breeding ground for them. But how to root them out of northern Idlib, this mountainous, hilly, it is such a military, it would be a grind, it would be hard, there would be all kinds of, because they live with their families and everything, so it would be civilian casualties. It's a mess. How do you, at some point, the pragmatists say you've got to have some kind of political recognition of this. Now,
I get it. I
don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. And I would have, I think that the current Russian leadership is not cold and brutal enough to deal with this problem.
In 10, 15 years, we're going to be back here and we're going to be talking about Aleppo.
Look, the conflict in Ukraine, this happened back in 1949 and 1950 when a CIA-backed insurgency of former SS fighters from Ukraine that the U.S. attempted to lead an insurgency. Operation Red Sox. Politico even did an article about it, and they said, yeah, okay, they're Nazis, but they're Nazis with us against the communists, right? This all happened before in Ukraine. This has happened before in Syria, and it will happen again. The problem is these are very difficult social, ethnic, religious problems that there's just sometimes no easy solution to.
Yeah.
And when you have an opponent that is doing everything they can to exploit those divisions and weaponize them against Syria, against Russia, and here we're talking the U.S., we're talking Turkey, it's very difficult to see a solution. And hands off to the Kremlin, for their attempt to manage the situation with Turkey and limit the geopolitical differences so it doesn't turn into another Russian-Turkish war, right? Because that's the last thing Russia needs right now. Yeah. Erdogan also understands that that's the last thing he needs. Unfortunately, Russia and Turkey need each other economically, particularly Russia right now with Turkey. Yeah,
and militarily,
because
like I said, keeping them out the Black Sea.
A lot of the gas that is going to countries in Europe like Hungary and Slovakia and Serbia, that goes through Turkey. That's Turk Stream, right? Russia is building nuclear power plants in Turkey. Russian tourists go to Turkey, as their number one destination. It's unfortunately they're intertwined to a degree that
you can't touch them. That relationship is sacrosanct. Like you need that relationship.
The question is, if Erdogan would have went away, would the solution to him be better or worse? Right? Would it be closer to the U.S.? Would it be more Islam? You don't know. All right. So unfortunately, he's the beast. I'm of the opinion that you want to avoid direct war with Turkey, that the separation is good, but you still, with those geopolitical differences, need to deal with Erdogan from a position of overwhelming strength. You can't show him weakness. You've got to keep your boot on that snake. You've got to keep your boot on that snake.
Otherwise, you're going to be blackmailed by jihadists. Meaning he knows of the relationship. He understands they need me. They can't do without me.
He does.
And if I go, it may be
the way
worse.
He plays the U.S. and Russia off each other again and again and again. I mean, eventually he's going to fail, right? Eventually his ego is going to write checks.
He hasn't up to this point.
Geopolitical position can't cash.
Yeah, he hasn't up to this point, though. Before I let you go, Mark, we have about 4 minutes. Can we get into Blinken telling Ukraine, hey, we need you to put your kids out there? Now, this is pretty wild. 52% of Ukrainians at this point said they want the war over with, even soldiers. This was under Gallup polling. And despite that, you have Blinken saying, yeah, we need people to carry those weapons. Mind you, Blinken is fired. Blinken is on his way out. Yeah, we need people to carry those weapons, so we need you to conscript
Is
your
the deep state
18-year-old
ever really on the way out?
Blinken is. I'm just saying, whoever takes his place, fair enough. But that ass is on his way out. That sociopath. I've watched them grab people off the streets with their mama hitting them with like an umbrella or something because they were dragging their kids off to die. And Blinken is out here screaming, yeah, well, you're going to be a part of NATO, but we need you to bring your kids into this war.
They need to continue the war.
Is this going to matter? The one iota?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's going to happen. I mean, it was always just a matter of time. Yeah. Now, the big problem here, a lot of people don't understand this. Under 25s have never been conscripted in Ukraine. Right. They've been volunteers were accepted, but they have never been conscripted. And the reason for that is that the demographic narrowing of the Ukrainian population, the shrinking population. Essentially, since 1990, since independence, Ukrainians stopped having kids, right? Because economic times, corruption, social political tension, they just stopped having children, right? It's a first world problem, but it's so extreme in Ukraine. So you have a large population of 35 and plus 40, 50-year-olds who were born before the self-dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then that population gets much smaller as you come up to the present day, right? That's that 18 to 25. And that's the crucial years when people have kids, right? So if those young men die, the future of Ukraine is gone, right? They won't be able to sustain a population into the future. The population of Ukraine has already effectively shrunk from 50 million in 1991. Right now, it's somewhere between 25 and 30 million.
Whoa, it's dying. The country is dying.
It's dying. It's dying multiple ways, right? Refugees to Europe, millions of refugees to Russia, millions of Ukrainians now becoming Russians, the casualties in the battlefield, right? It's dying so many ways. And simply, bad health care and high suicide rates and everything else. It's Antony Blinken, what the U.S. is demanding of the Kiev regime ruling elite is you have to sacrifice the future of your country to let some future sliver rump state of Ukraine to be brought under our control in NATO. That's exactly what they're saying.
That is
but this is the death knell of Ukraine.
And all of these people are waving flags saying, we support Ukraine, we support Ukraine. Like, that just astonishing. It is shocking to me. Mark, one last, I'm sorry, before I let you go, I got to get you to say something about Georgia. Look, as I've said it before to my audience, I consider all of this stuff to be one global war that is being fought out.
This is all part of World War III right now.
Yeah,
it's all part of World War III.
That are being done through proxies at this point. And
we've seen the conflict in Ukraine, in Africa, now in Syria, the regime change attempt you could even make an argument that the attempted presidential coup by the president in South Korea could possibly be connected
to Ukraine. America didn't have much to say as that man was taking dictatorial powers.
Yeah. The U.S. wants the South Korean military-industrial complex pumping out arms and gear for the Ukraine conflict continuously, not the little bit that they've given so far. And the left-dominated parliament in South Korea is against it. So
kudos to them. I mean, they came out. I mean, they were fighting them. Well, fighting cameras, barricades. They were holding the line for their parliament to say no. Kudos to them on that front. But Georgia, is this going to be another Ukraine? It seems that the Georgian prime minister is hell-bent that it is not going to be another Ukraine. He even goes so far as to say this will not be Maidan 2.0.
Be another Maidan.
Yeah, this is not going to happen.
So obviously at this point,
no, please go for it.
Yeah, obviously at this point, the important thing is the Georgian police and security services and military are still behind the Georgian government. That is the most crucial thing, right? So obviously, you know, the recent elections prove that a majority of the population is behind the prime minister, but it's a close majority, right? Yeah. There's still 30, 35, 40% of the population that is all for becoming the next front against Russia, right? That want to be part of the West, whatever the cost, right? That's the way it is framed. It is framed as a geopolitical choice by the West themselves. So it's a really dicey situation. And what we're going to see next is dead protesters.
Yeah, right? That was my thought. Exactly.
We've already heard that. Georgian TV actually caught protesters saying, we need corpses. People won't turn up unless we roll out some corpses, right? They said it exactly that, right? It was on Georgian TV. Now, hopefully, the Georgian people are aware enough now of this that it will be contained. But we don't know, right? And if you'll remember, in the first Maidan, all the evidence points to that it was actually Georgian snipers, right, who are now part of the Georgian International Legion in Ukraine, right, who were part of that. And they've filtered along with a bunch of other Kiev regime militiamen off the Maidan into Georgia now, right? The Georgian police have... The Georgian police have put out there that 1/3 of all the protesters they've detained are not Georgians.
Right.
They're Europeans or Ukrainians.
Right. So, man, I am very concerned about the Georgia thing because I agree with you. Like, eventually people are going to get killed. Last question. What is Russia thinking about this? Because they have to know that the entire point of this is to have another front, that Ukraine failed. We believe, I mean, net means net. People may not remember, but Georgia was noted in net means net. That it was like the attempts to get Georgia and Ukraine into NATO is seen by skepticism with Russia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Russia is clearly paying attention to what is taking place in Georgia. What is their thoughts about it and the way it's
right now? Their thoughts are, right, they have to rely on, at some level, I'm sure they reached out to the Georgian government, the Georgian Dream Party. Do you need any help? And has to remember, the Georgian Dream Party is not pro-Russian.
Right.
They're just not rabidly anti-Russian, right? That's the way, right? They have their issues with Russia, but they don't want to be the next proxies against them. So Russia has very little influence to, or room to do anything here. They have to count. Russia's view of all of this is they are winning on the battlefield in Ukraine, and they have to stay laser focused on that, because everything else now is U.S. recognition that they've lost on the battlefield in Ukraine. So they try to spin all this destabilization up here in Syria, in Georgia, in Serbia, right, where there's more tension again right now because Kosovar Albanian forces have been sent into the Serb majority north of Kosovo. All of this, it is an attempt to destabilize the situation around Russia and say, stop. If you don't stop, we're going to keep poking you here and there and there and there, right? Because if we can't win on the battlefield, on the contact line in Ukraine, we will be the masters of destabilization that we are, and we will spin everything up all around you. The important takeaway is they are not giving up.
Yeah.
And this is not going to stop because Trump takes office again in 40 some days.
Would you call it the last gasp of the unipolar world?
That famous quote, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born.
Yeah.
Right? That's where
man,
we are.
This has been
Now is the time of monsters.
This is terrifying. Thank you for this, man. A fantastic breakdown. I have greatly enjoyed this breakdown. Mark Sloboda, International Relations Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sloboda1, on his YouTube channel at Real Politic with Mark Sloboda. Definitely check that out. And on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it, Mark. You have a good one.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That was a fantastic interview. Just wow. I mean, you may hear a breakdown of stuff from either Syria or, for the matter, Georgia or anything like that, but nobody breaks it down like Mark Sloboda. He really gives you the details. And look, we've had Mark on, God, for years, and he has been more right on this than pretty much anyone else that we've had on the show. So I deeply appreciate him joining me on this front. Dark times. Like you said, it's a new world being born. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. You have a unipolar, a hegemonic empire. And that empire knows that it is creaking around the seams and that other institutions, other groups don't like the way it is going. Meaning you have all of these other countries around the world saying, we want something else. We don't like this. And you get the hegemons effectively saying, whoa, 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 why don't you like this? But it's not being expressed in a verbal, in a overt sense. It's being expressed in this kind of low-level proxy fighting that is taking place all over the globe that is still coming from one source. That one source being, we are trying to maintain control. We're losing in Syria. Okay, well, let's expand it to Georgia. Oh, let's expand it in Syria since there's a Russian presence in Syria. Let's do that also. It's that. It's not one specific individual thing. That's why I keep pointing out we're in a global war. We're in a global war right now. The only difference is those wars, if they're direct, are so expensive that the objective is to keep them indirect. We're going to maintain control through various means. Yes, a lot of people will get killed. However, this is the way we're going to go with doing the war. It's disgusting. It's dirty in the way that we're basically treating people. We don't seem to care all that much about life. And yet, this is where we are. This is where we are. I want to show Joe Biden was in a meeting with African delegates. While Joe Biden was in that meeting with African delegates, Joe Biden, representative of the U.S. empire, the man himself, old, tired, on his way out, fell asleep in the meeting. This is humiliating, but this is just one humiliating thing that Joe Biden has done over the course of his term. As I pointed out before, the worst president in the history, or at the very least, of my awareness in this country.
With the U.S. in support of the development of the Lobito Corridor. Tanzania views the Lobito Corridor as an integral part of a broader strategy to enhance connectivity in Africa. We also appreciate the fact that the implementation of the project will provide important opportunities for Africa's development in sectors such as agriculture, renewable energy, digital, trade, and logistics along the corridor. Tanzania is already undertaking internal consultations aiming at aligning this project with national priorities and other bilateral and regional commitments. In closing, allow me to...
That's unfortunate. The man just pardoned his kid, getting all sorts of flack for pardoning his kid, and then turns around and falls asleep in a meeting as he goes to Africa and talks to people on his way out. That is deeply humiliating. And yet, that is our president. That is the representative of freedom and democracy around the world. In other news, as we were having this conversation, there is now an investigation into South Korea's president. As you know, the South Korean president, Yoon, tried to overthrow the government, as we were talking about it the other day. Now, the interesting part to this is Yoon Suk Yeol, still president, not for long. He needs to go. He needs to go. He needs to not just, I'll say it again, he needs to not just step down and resign. He needs to be prosecuted to the highest extent of the law without the shallowest bit of compassion or understanding. He needs to be put in a cage. You rarely hear me say that somebody needs to be put into a cage. I think we put too many people in cages. He needs to be put into a cage. He tried to literally overthrow the government of South Korea. Now, this man is already obsequious to the US government in a way that South Koreans hate. He is at a less than 20% approval rating to get across how low he is regarded in that country. And being regarded that low, not being able to get his policies through because they're apparently unpopular, he decides, I'm going to be God. I'm going to be a king. And we don't need parliament. We don't need these other factors coming into play that's getting on my nerves and stopping me from doing what I want to do. So I am just going to take control of it all. And that's what he tried to do. And come to find out, he didn't do it on his own. So under normal circumstances, even when you see people who are individual, oftentimes the United States individualizes leadership. So it would be Putin. It would be the Ayatollah. It would be pick any random person, Xi Jinping. No person gets the power on their own. Zero. None. It requires an apparatus. It requires a power base. It requires something to allow that person to stay in power. The same thing is true for him. When he decided to do this, he had people who were backing him as he did this. The problem that he ran into was he had so much opposition, withering opposition, even in his own party, that made it impractical for this to continue. Not to mention, at some point, the question would have been, are you going to shoot other South Koreans? Every coup at some point has to deal with that, because you are going to meet withering opposition from a majority of the population that does not want this to happen. And that majority of the population will show up initially with their bodies, later with guns. You are overthrowing the legitimate government because you can't get done what you want to get done. And you get a US that is very quiet, very quiet. They're criticizing Georgia and that government that won the Georgia Dream Party. Oh, they would criticize that. You have a French-born president, which, again, no person of dual citizenship should ever be put in a position of government. Full stop. There are dual loyalties built into it right off the bat. And in that case, instead of her representing the legitimate political will of the Georgian population in Georgia, she's screaming that she wants the government to be part of NATO. She believes there's Russian interference, even though she can't prove it or even point to it. This is what is happening in Georgia, where they're doing anything in their power to overthrow that government. Right now, that government is standing strong, saying this will not be another Ukraine. This will not be Maidan 2.0. And they have brought in the police to prevent it from being overthrown. Now, the catch becomes, how long can they do that? How much energy do these NGOs, these groups coming from out the country, no less, have to keep trying to push to overthrow that government. Clearly, the US backs the overthrow of the Georgian government. Clearly, the EU backs the overthrow of the Georgian government. And because Ukraine fell, they believe that they can do the same thing in Georgia. I am radically against this idea of creating a standard that can continuously be propagated. They need to lose. And part of the reason I am very clear, my point, that they need to lose in Ukraine. And so they don't look at Taiwan and say, hey, let's try that again in Taiwan. Hey, let's try that again somewhere else. I need them to lose. And Georgia is one of those locations where they need to definitively lose. This notion of continuously getting all of these people killed. For what? Because they want to stay in control. And so other people's lives in other countries don't matter as much in lieu of that control. I mean, Blinken literally came out and tells Ukraine, I need you to sacrifice your children for America. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I mean, Ukraine. We need you to sacrifice your kids for Ukraine. The country is already dying. People are fleeing in droves. This was even before the war. And now a policy that was meant to try to protect their youth. They're like, look, man, we appreciate it, but we need you to go out and die for us. This is Blinken. Oh, my guest is here. Okay, I'm going to go to my guest. I'm running my mouth. We are joined. Daniel Lazare, the man himself. Daniel Lazare is an independent author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, and government and social policy in general. He's written several books, one of which, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, and The Velvet Coup, America's Undeclared War. Daniel, you are the person I thought about when I was thinking about Georgia and Maidan 2.0. Man, welcome to the show. How you doing this morning? You doing all right?
Doing just fine, just fine.
Man, thank you for joining me. I have been blown away by the length, and maybe I shouldn't be, that they are willing to go to overthrow the Georgian government. Initially, you had the Farah debacle, which I don't know why it's the debacle, where you get people in the State Department screaming about Georgia having a Farah law when the U.S. has a Farah law. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, well, why are they making this a big deal? Okay, well, obviously they're making this a big deal because they want to be able to dump money into Georgian politics without the Georgian government being aware of where the money is coming from, just like they do it in other countries with NGOs and whatnot. And so Georgia was against it. The U.S. screamed about it, saying this was anti-democratic and that this was moving them away from Europe. It's like, so not having Europe dump money into our politics is moving us away from Europe. Okay, sure it is. But then you get protests over and over, many of which are not even Georgians. You get European leaders, just like they did in Ukraine, showing up saying, we don't like this government. We don't like this government. I know they just won an election, but we don't like it. Then you get even the indignity of not Victoria Nuland handing out cookies, but some other sociopath handing out other baked goods. They are doing everything in their power to overthrow this government. And at this point, the prime minister has said, we will not be another Maidan 2.0. This is not going to happen here. Is anything I said untrue, first? And two, expand upon it. Give us more context. What's going on? Give me your take.
Well, I think you're basically right. I mean, I think that Georgia faces a giant EU, NATO, U.S. push to overthrow the elected government, to install a pro-Western government, and a government which will essentially adopt a hostile attitude towards Russia. This is the thrust of the U.S. EU campaign. I'm not saying that there were no irregularities in the last month's or October 26 parliamentary elections.
Fair enough.
There appear to be some examples of ballot stuffing, etc. But the margin of victory was so big, 17 points.
Wow.
It's difficult to imagine that that really mattered in the long run. These policies, these EU policies, are not popular in Georgia. Georgia does not want to be dragged into a war, into the Ukraine war. The Georgian Dream Party stressed very heavily that they ran campaign ads showing devastated Ukrainian cities and healthy, vibrant, prosperous Georgian cities. And they said, we do not want that. And Russia is their big neighbor. The Georgian Dream Party, quite pragmatically, believes that it should, have a policy of getting along with Russia, the same way that Canadian politicians think it's important to maintain good relations with the U.S. I mean, this is just a fact of life. If you're Belgium living next to France, then you've got to get along with France. That's the way the world works. And if you're Canada and if you're Georgia, you've got to get along with your giant neighbor to the north. So this is the equivalent of what if Russia was pushing Canada to adopt a hostile policy towards the U.S. and was fomenting street riots in Montreal and Toronto, and pushing to overthrow the Canadian government.
We would say that Canada is an independent country, and if they wanted to raise a military on the U.S. border, and if they wanted to put in intelligence officials and missiles and guns and bullets and threaten the U.S., well, Canada is an independent country. Canada can do whatever it wants. Clearly, that's what the U.S. would say.
Exactly what the U.S. would say, what Washington would say, just as Joe Biden said he would never, ever pardon his son. So that is exactly how we would take such assurances. So Georgia is torn. The EU is fomenting a revolution. The interesting thing about Georgia is that Georgia has this huge, overblown NGO sector. NGO is non-governmental organizations, foreign-funded non-governmental organizations. They have completely distorted economic and political life, because they pay salaries far in excess of what most, other employers in Georgia can pay. So if you're a college graduate, your goal is to get a job with a foreign-funded NGO, and you then adopt that foreign-funded NGO's political outlook. This is quite clear. The presence, the sector is huge. The salaries they pay are huge, and the influence they wield in a city like Tbilisi is huge. So again, it's as if Russia bought out all the major newspapers and et cetera, and think tanks and charitable organizations in Toronto and Montreal, and created a huge pro-Russian sector. I'm not trying to portray Russia as, in some way, totally benign, totally democratic society. That's not my point. No. But this war in the Ukraine is a disaster. The so-called International War Party, which is behind it, is facing defeat. Yeah. They are desperate. And they're involved in a last gasp effort to maintain themselves, and that involves subverting countries like Georgia.
Do you think the government is going to be able to withstand this pressure from Europe that's being applied? I was watching. This is Rutt. Right here. So he is having this conversation. NATO. I can't think of his title right now. But Rutt is giving the speech about democracy. And what's wild about this speech is that he is, what is it, speaking with a forked tongue? even though he's talking about democracy, what he's talking about is overthrowing the Georgian government as a democratic act, which is pretty astonishing. And then, that other lunatic, Annalena Baerbock, they come on to say this stuff. Right here, this
moment is that all allies are making clear that any actions that undermine the democracy in Georgia, or to take democracy further, also on its road to more EU and NATO integration, Euro-Atlantic integration, so to say, that they really urge the Georgian government to stay on the path they decided a couple of years ago to be active on and not to retreat.
Do they understand that the very act of, meaning what they're doing is an antithesis to any notion of democratic order? And that the pressure that they're putting on Georgia is more of a reason the government be skeptical of the European Union. Meaning, even though he's saying, hey, being part of the European Union is democracy. That's what democracy is. By the same token, what they're doing is the antithesis of democracy. Meaning they're not trying to give Georgia an honest choice, where Georgia says, yes, we want to be part of Europe, and we're going to make votes, and we're going to move toward. It's not that. They're effectively saying, hey, the European Union is democracy, and so you should be a part of that democracy, even if we need to overthrow you to make you a part of that, quote unquote, democracy. Everything that they're doing is legitimizing the very acts of the government, whether it's the FARA thing, whether it's bringing out the cops to crack the heads of protesters. I mean, these guys are out there setting Parliament on fire, for God's sake. And you get Europe coming out with the same playbook that they did for Ukraine. These are just peaceful protesters. They're holding lilies, and they're holding lilies as they're getting beat by cops. And even when they get beat by cops, they still raise their hand up with the lily. I mean, this is nonsense. Give me your take on that. I mean, certainly they know that they're taking this. Certainly they know they're trying to overthrow the government, regardless of what they're saying, right?
Yeah, well, it smacks of January 6th.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think what we're seeing in Georgia is a giant January 6th.
Yeah.
It's completely, and Rutte is the head of NATO. And
Yes.
NATO is a war machine.
I just can't think of his exact title, but yeah.
And this is he's general director, I believe. And this is completely that pursuing a very aggressive policy. But what's very important to bear in mind is that policy is failing. The NATO strategy is in tatters.
Yeah.
The war, they're losing the war in the Ukraine, which they provoked. They have a disaster in the Middle East. The U.S. is backing the jihadists who are trying to overthrow the Syrian government.
Yeah.
I mean, these people are engaged in a series of highly provocative, highly dangerous military operations all over the world, and they're not going well. And there's a huge popular resistance to these policies. Now, that the resistance takes a form I don't especially like. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. I'm not a fan of Viktor Orban in Hungary, obviously.
But is there another form that it could take, though? I mean, look, I get it, man. I'm not for some of these guys are not the most cuddly in the world. I guess my thing is, though, aren't they like I always say, we create our monsters? Isn't this that?
Look, it's highly ironic that this anti-NATO movement is dominated by the ultra-right.
It is very weird.
As a Marxist, I am completely, I'm totally horrified. I'm not completely surprised, because when you have the left, as thoroughly expunged as it has been since 1989 to 91, it's kind of predictable that these anti-war sentiments would migrate to the far right, and that's what we're seeing. And we're seeing, these ultra nationalists pick up this banner, this anti-war banner. So I don't support Trump. I don't support Viktor Orban, and I don't support Birgina Ivanishvili, the head of the Georgian Dream Party in Georgia.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, I understand that the people there don't want to be dragged into a war, and
Yeah.
especially a losing war. They don't want to see their countries destroyed. Is that any
Well,
great
I think
surprise?
all of Europe is moving towards that, though. Like when we were
Yeah.
covering I was covering the European elections, and I remember I kept telling my ex-girlfriend, I was like, "Look, all of these countries are going to collapse. There's no way these governments are going to be able to maintain this idea of war with Ukraine, with Russia." And I said, more to the point, even if they take the propaganda, meaning even if they think Russia was fully responsible, it was fully unprovoked, people don't tend to like to take on difficulties and hardship for something else. And at a certain point, they're going to say, okay, all of this money is going. I'm taking cold showers. Our energy production is going down. We are being deindustrialized. They're not going to want to accept that. And I know Annalena Baerbock will come out and say, well, I don't really care what Germans think. This is the direction we're going to go, even if they have to suffer hardship. Okay, well, she's not suffering hardship. They are. Like, it's pretty outrageous. The French government has just collapsed. Now, this was this canard that Macron had put up, where initially during the elections, the Renaissance Party, I believe, came in third, Macron's party. Macron couldn't accept it, and so he did local elections, meaning basically dissolving parliament, having elections again. His party lost again, this time around with the far right party, the National Rally, ends up winning that, Marie Le Pen's party. And instead, he says, okay, well, they have a second round of elections, and they do horse trading in order to keep the National Rally from power. But then you get the far left party and the group of parties that are working with the far left party to win. And yet, he puts in Michael Barnier as head of the parliament with what I called at the time a mini coup. Okay, well, that's just fallen apart with a no confidence vote that has destroyed the French government at this point. So the French government has fallen. Give me your take on this. I mean, were you surprised, shocked, horrified? Like, what was your take on this as all of this was kind of playing out? And again, if there's anything I said you disagree with, please say so. But otherwise, also give me your take.
Well, I think that Marine Le Pen and the ultra and her far right National Rally are essentially calling the shots and moving to take power. The New Popular Front, led by Mélenchon's La France Insoumise, France Unbowed, just doesn't have the muscle, and they are locked in a popular front with the Greens and the Social Democrats, and that left-wing coalition is extremely, it's riven by contradictions, is extremely unsteady. It actually kind of recapitulates all the failures of the original Popular Front, led by Blum in 1936, which was a disaster, and it's one of the opening acts of World War II, the National Front didn't win, but it got a plurality, and therefore they have the upper hand. And Macron is trying to buy time with a minority government led by Barnier, but it's not working. It's falling apart. And so it has no authority, no political heft. So therefore, it's just collapsed, and no one knows what's going to happen. But it appears that the result will be further momentum and a further shift in Le Pen's favor, and certainly the election of Trump favors that. I mean, this whole neoliberal program, this whole super powerful neoliberal edifice, which has essentially ruled for the last 40 years. It's kind of like the Communist Party. It's what the Communist Party was to the Soviet Union. This neoliberal edifice was to the U.S. and the EU and the whole globe, in fact. But it's falling apart. It's kind of the West is kind of facing its own 1989 to 91. It's discredited. Its hypocrisies are all too apparent. No one believes it. It's failing, obviously. I mean, most particularly in in the Ukraine and the Middle East. Economically, I think a crash is on the way, in my humble opinion, and people are running for the exits. That's it. They don't want to be part of this international war party. And so therefore they are, therefore you're seeing fighting breaking out on the periphery in Georgia first and foremost, but in other countries as well. So, so it's
no, please.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
You've often have been a critic of the U.S. Constitution, and I'm wondering, is the criticism of the U.S. Constitution because of the way the U.S. has basically run the world, especially if you're talking about Europe, whether it's foreign policy and all these things, they've basically been subservient to U.S. interests on this front, even to the point of deindustrializing Europe. I mean, Angela Merkel apparently put in her book that the U.S. didn't seem to mind to undercut those economies in Europe, meaning we don't care that you're allies, you're still enemies from the standpoint of economic expansion. Is it fair to say that the criticism of the U.S. Constitution is also a criticism of U.S. policy in regards to the hegemonic way it runs the world? Like, meaning, is because as we're saying, it's a neoliberal economic order that seems to be collapsing, not just in the U.S., but also in Europe. Is the criticism, can it be fair to say it's not limited to just the U.S. Constitution? It's the way the West as a whole run the world. Does it make sense? Like, it's not necessarily isolated to the U.S. The criticism really can be applied to all of the West in the way that it has a certain amount of hegemonic control over the globe that seems to be eroding. Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with the U.S. Constitution is it's extremely first of all, it's extremely old and extremely undemocratic. It does not reflect the will of the people. It dates from 1787. I mean, it's a document. It's a slave owner's document. It's closer in spirit to the Holy Roman Empire, which was still in existence when the Constitution was created, than to a modern democracy. We have the Electoral College, which greatly exaggerates the power of lily white rural states like Wyoming, and penalizes multiracial giants like California. We have a Senate based on equal state representation, in which the 54% of the country, which lives in just 10 states, is outvoted 4-1 by the minority in the other 40. We have a House that's distorted by gerrymandering. We have a Supreme Court which is completely unaccountable to the democratic public. I guess that pretty much takes care of it. So it's a monstrosity. It's an 18th century monstrosity, which is increasingly undemocratic, does not reflect the will of the people, the American, and society is falling apart as a consequence. I mean, I don't care how good a driver you are. If your car is falling apart, you're going to have an accident on the highway. It'll be very dangerous. And
just to interrupt, I'm sorry. I guess my point is that criticism, though, is it fair to say that criticism on some level can be applied to the West as a whole? Yes. Like, meaning, is that a criticism of neoliberalism? I know you're going to the specifics of the government. I accept that. Fair enough. And I even agree with you on all of that. I guess my thought, though, is it seems that the West has lumped itself into one thing. And that one thing seems to be falling apart. And I guess I'm saying, can criticism also be applied to the whole, not just one of the parts, if that makes sense?
Yes. I mean, America runs the world. American politics, therefore, dominate global politics. American law dominates international law. So you have this rickety, old, undemocratic structure, and it promotes an undemocratic global structure, and it prevents the American people from seeing what's really being done in their name. So, and these wars are not going well for the American working class. The American working class has been reeling for the last 30 or 40 years, but yet they have no democratic opportunity to debate these policies, essentially, because government is in the hands of these grotesque Washington neocon elites. So yeah, I mean, it's all of a piece. The world is crying out for democracy. Americans are crying out for democracy, and they're not getting it. So I think that what we're seeing here is an extremely undemocratic global structure, breathing its last breaths. It's in deep trouble, and I think that what we're seeing in Georgia is a manifestation of that.
Daniel, I'm curious on something else. What happens now in France? I'm sorry to bounce back to France, but now that the government has collapsed, now what? So what structure are they're going to cobble together in order to keep going? As you pointed out, Macron, because look, this was a canard. I remember when I was at work when this took place, and I was like, this is a coup. And my boss thought it was funny because he was like, well, hey, man, I told you Macron was going to find a way to play one against the other in order to keep them apart. Okay, well, that's fallen apart. So I guess the question is now what? What does France do now?
Well, I think what's happening is that Macron is going to make a deal with Le Pen.
Man, like, and they have done everything in their power to keep power out of Le Pen's hands and out of the party's hands.
And what's ironic is the New Popular Front had made an electoral deal with Macron to a non-compete deal, essentially, where they would not challenge certain districts where Macron's party was strong. And so as a result, they expected that Macron would be on their side. This is very, very naive, and Léon Blum made the same mistakes in 1936.
Yeah.
But ironically, we're going to see Macron gravitate to the Le Pen camp, and he's going to enter into a deal with Le Pen. I think that's really quite clear, and that the New Popular Front is tripping over its own feet.
Wow, that is astonishing. I mean, and the reason I said it's astonishing, the audience may not necessarily pay attention to French politics, but keeping the Popular Front, or let's say the National Rally, out of politics has been what they've done for the last 40 years, give or take, since the war. And yet it has gained more and more supporters in the country itself, meaning everything that they've done to keep them out of power has failed fundamentally, especially if they're going to allow a deal with them. So how is this deal going to?
It's the same with Trump, by the way. I mean, everything that Democrats did to keep Trump out of power made Trump stronger. That's why the Democrats are so perplexed now. They're afraid that every time they open their mouth, Trump will gain strength. So so they're just like this, keeping their big trap shut. And the same thing is true in France. All the
what is this going to mean for French politics? What does this mean for the war? I mean, Macron has been part of the war party. The National Rally has been more skeptical of this, which on some level gives you this kind of context of what the French people are thinking in this case. What happens now from your point of view? Is this going to change how French engages in the war? I mean, Macron has gotten to the point of saying we need to send French troops into Ukraine, which is outrageous. So how is this going to change the politics of France in regards to either foreign policy or the war?
Well, I think that France will line up behind. If I'm correct about Le Pen, if she's gaining power, if Macron enters into a deal with her, I think that France will adopt a more nationalist policy and a policy of skepticism towards the war in the Ukraine, and that it will line up behind a Trump peace effort. Now, the Trump peace deal hasn't.
Let's put that in quotes. Yeah.
Let's put that in quotes. Hasn't happened yet, and the situation in the Middle East has gone from bad to worse.
Yeah.
This, I mean, I'm beginning to think that Gaza was really merely a warm up for the big show in Syria and Lebanon. This jihadist offensive is astonishing, very dangerous.
Agreed.
If Assad goes, this will be an earthquake in terms of Middle East politics. But that's what U.S. foreign policy has wrought.
Exactly.
Remember, the U.S. has been in tacit alliance with Al-Qaeda since 2011.
Yes.
This is what some of us tried to point out, and we were completely ignored. Idlib, this province in northern Syria, which is the base for the jihadists, they took it over in April 2015 because the Saudis, the U.S. allowed the Saudis to arm them with thousands of U.S. manufactured TOW missiles. The U.S. agreed to that. They were able to use those missiles to push the Assad forces out of Idlib. Idlib has been a stronghold, a jihadist stronghold ever since, and now they're armed with top-notch military equipment. They're launching an offensive against a Syrian government which is crippled by sanctions, which is devastated, economically devastated in a way we can barely comprehend by this U.S., UK, Saudi-backed, jihadist warfare from 2011 until 2017 or 18. They are just economically, they are just devastated. In fact, the World Bank says that in real terms, Syrian GDP has fallen 87% since 2011. That is almost incomprehensible.
Yeah, that's unimaginable.
I mean, the U.S. GDP in 1929 to 32, I think, fell by a third. Maybe actually more like 25%. This is 87%. It's just been devastated. Their soldiers are unpaid. That's why these jihadists were able to slice through the Syrian military so neatly. And now these Shiite forces are rushing in from Iraq to try to rescue the Assad government. But the U.S. is bombing them. The U.S. is on the side of Jawlani, this Al-Qaeda leader who claims to have broken with Al-Qaeda, but that's complete BS.
Yes, nonsense. They come up with new names every other week.
And so it is a horror show. So this whole neoliberal structure is collapsing, and the flames are shooting upwards.
Last time that Trump was in, I'm gonna put this in quotes, ended Obama's regime change war in Syria. When Trump was asked about this, he says, "Yeah, but we stole the oil. We kept the oil. We kept the oil. We kept the oil. But we pull our troops out otherwise." Effectively saying, yeah, we pulled out somewhat, but we still are holding on to the oil and the wheat that allows the government to sustain itself, or for that matter, to recobble itself back together. When Trump comes in this time around, he seems to have a laser focus on Iran. He has the best administration that Israel could buy, getting $100 million apparently from Miriam Adelson to have an Israeli first policy going forward. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are no longer on board for this. All of these guys are either associated with BRICS or at the very least have come up with friendships with Iran to bring down some of them.
Those guys are all in the U.S. pocket, believe you me.
Fair enough.
This is complete nonsense. The Saudis, Qatar hosts one of the largest military bases in the world. Fair enough. I accept that. Probably in the U.S. camp.
No, I do accept that, but it seems that Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states came out against this terrorist, democracy-loving terrorists that are apparently invading, especially back by Turkey. Yeah. The Middle East seems to have changed on some level since Trump was there last time. The last time Trump was there, he had Saudi Arabia, all of these states come up with the Abraham Accords. He had Saudi Arabia's backing and putting pressure on Iran, especially with the killing of Soleimani. That is not the same Middle East today, or do you disagree with that?
Well, I disagree. I agree with some parts. I mean, I agree that it's not the same Middle East.
Yeah.
But these regimes in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, these are despicable, corrupt, ultra-reactionary regimes. They are horrible. They are completely in the U.S. camp. They're Sunni. I'm not trying to make this, I'm not trying to make this a religious sectarian argument, but they are deeply hostile to Iran. And Trump is hostile to Iran too. And the brutalization of Iran has been extraordinary, and I despise that regime also. But nonetheless, its treatment at the hands of the U.S. has been extraordinary, and Trump is redoubling, doubling down on anti-Iran hostility, but the HTS, the Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham jihadis in Syria, they're fiercely anti-Iranian also.
Right.
And they are tacitly on the side of Israel, and Israel is backing them.
Yes.
I mean, it is a giant cluster. You know what? It is just a mess, and everything the U.S. is doing is adding to the chaos in that region. And this is filled with millions of people who don't want war any more than people in Georgia do. Yeah. And the U.S. is essentially promoting a pro-war policy. Now, I don't know what Trump will do. I mean, it's his world. We're all just living in it. So I don't know what he's going to do. But he's facing a giant mess of his own making.
Yeah. Well, wait. You said of his own making.
Well, the pulling out of the 2015 nuclear accord with Iran was a horror, and doubling down on sanctions, killing Soleimani. These are acts of brutal aggression, and it's left Iran crippled, and therefore Iran's enemies are taking advantage. And first and foremost among them is HTS, this neo Al Qaeda force, which is now advancing in Syria.
Well, I mean, from my understanding, they are democracy-loving terrorists. That's the way they've been described, or the way Erdogan described them, as the Syrian people. When he had the conversation with Putin, he made this point of saying that these were Assad needs to listen to the Syrian people. And it's like, dude, I just watched one of those quote-unquote Syrian people chop the head off of a child. And we are aligning with people who are effectively doing this, running havoc over the Middle East. Do you see any sort of resolution to this at all? I mean, whether it's in Georgia, whether it's in the Middle East, I mean, I know it's early in all of this. Apparently, Iran is talking about sending in troops. Like you said, troops were coming in from Iraq, which we were bombing and attacking. We were doing bombing runs, basically Air Force for Al Qaeda. Do you see this resolving? I mean, and let me ask this question in a different way. I strongly believe that all of this stuff is a global war that has been unacknowledged. All of these wars seem to be coming from the same place and seem to be coming on some level of the same ends of maintaining some level of control that they seem to be losing control of. How do you see this? Do you see this as the birth of a new world, where this kind of multipolarity that the U.S. is fighting against is what is trying to come into some level of existence in this chaos? It's a way of trying to keep that from happening. How do you frame all of these events that are taking place around the globe right now?
Well, yes, in a certain sense, the U.S. is trying to forestall chaos. In a certain sense, but however, everything it does just furthers that chaos. The structure is falling apart. It's completely falling apart. I mean, in the Middle East, we've seen first of all, we've seen the horrendous, vicious, and unbelievably stupid October 7th operation by Hamas, which has led to the eradication of Hamas, essentially, and unparalleled devastation raining down on the heads of the 2.4 million residents of Gaza. But now we've seen the war extend to Lebanon. We've seen the decapitation of Hezbollah, and now we're seeing the follow-up where these Sunni terrorists take advantage of Hezbollah's weakness. Hezbollah is Shiite, by the way, and are now advancing through Syria. The Assad dynasty. I don't defend the Assad dynasty, but the Assad dynasty has at least maintained a certain level of secular interreligious comity, which is very, very important. Because I believe in that very, very strongly, and of course Al Jolani, the head of HTS, is determined to destroy that.
Well, real quick, Al Jolani is the one that the New York Times did that piece on, right? That we were paying as a warlord.
Yeah, the U.S. has been on the side of these forces since 2011. I mean, in 2011, Hillary Clinton convened a Friends of Syria conference that was attended by the Saudis and others, and they decided to start supplying arms to the rebel forces, and they used the Muslim Brotherhood as a conduit, and the Muslim Brotherhood includes Hamas. Hamas was on the side of the rebels.
Right.
I mean, it's unbelievable. And so now these rebels are advancing on the Assad government. So the U.S. has just sown chaos. Now, I don't want to make it out that the U.S. is this completely all-powerful force that just pushes a button and entire countries collapse. I mean, the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, has tons and tons of problems of its own.
Of course.
This region is in deep trouble. It really isn't, it really is one of the most trouble-plagued regions of the world due to, for a lot of reasons. But we can't neglect the fact that that it suffers from a long reactionary religious oppression that is has just been crippling, absolutely devastating. And I'm not trying to make an anti-Islamic argument any more than I would point out that the Catholic Church has been a major factor in underdevelopment in southern Italy or Latin America, et cetera, et cetera. But that region is in just deep trouble, but everything the U.S. is doing is just served to just pound it down further and further.
Chaos.
Horrible.
Yeah. Daniel, man, thank you for this. I always appreciate your takes on this stuff. You are extraordinarily well-rounded. I think we've been around the world at this point, and your analysis has been dead on. Daniel Lazar is an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution and American politics, government, and social policy in general. He has written several books, including The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Daniel, you can follow Daniel on Twitter at DHLazar, and you can read his column on weeklyworker.co.uk and strategicculture.org. Daniel, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. Great conversation, by the way.
Thanks a lot.
All right. We are going to keep the energy moving. Just so you all know, my name is Jamal Thomas. In case any of you are new, you can catch me 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Monday through Friday. If you dig this content, give it a like. Hit that like button, share this content, subscribe to this channel. We are trying to grow. We're trying to get to 40,000 by the end of the year. And damn it, I think we can do it. Also, if you dig this content, you can really support it through PayPal, Patreon, or for that matter, Super Chat. All stickers will be read, providing they're not racist, sexist, or bigoted, etc., etc. Good show this morning. Mark and Daniel have been on it, and he's right. Chaos has been the name of the game. Chaos is what they seem to be after. And a lot of this stuff seems to be panic from a world that is changing. It's that. Like, you get a strong push from a large part of the world saying, we want something different. Full stop. We don't want this hegemon stuff. We want to deal with each other as equals. We want to use our own currencies. We want to develop in the way that we develop without this kind of foreign intrusion of this overthrow in the various countries or something like that. We don't want that. We want something else. We want that to stop. And you get a reaction from the global order that is willing to burn it down in order to keep it the way it is. Like, for all this talk about how much money it costs to change, we never really talk about how much it costs just to keep things the way that they are. And it seems that the people who are, let's say, in a spot of authority, who don't necessarily want to give up that position of authority, and I mean this not necessarily from the standpoint of a singular country, this gap, what is it called? The Tunisian, it'll come to me in a moment. But this notion that when a rising power is dealing with an established power, that there ends up being a war. Initially, I thought that was going to be between countries, but it doesn't seem like that's the issue between countries. That seems to be this kind of a prevailing ideology in the way the world works, coming up against a new ideology in the way that they want the world to work. And how these things are rubbing each other with the prevailing ideology, doing any and everything in its power, setting fire across the globe in order to keep things the way it is, even if it uses head-chopping terrorists to do so. The Syrian barber who's there cutting hair gets his head chopped off. The haberdasher who makes hats gets his head chopped off. I'm trying to put out that regardless of what you think of Assad or what you think of the people who are leading these countries, they may or may not be decent people. They can be horrible people. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay to invade their country with head choppers. It's just outrageous to me. And the same thing is true for Georgia. You may not like the Georgian government, but it's the government that won. And it won specifically or part in part, because it didn't necessarily want to deal with this notion of being a front in a war for the US or for the matter for Europe. Macron has just lost his head. And what the government is going to be after that, I don't know. If they join forces with Marine Le Pen, oh my God, that is historic for all sorts of reasons. But namely, they did everything out in their power to keep the National Rally from taking power, even with this mini coup that Macron pulled off by putting in Barnier. What comes next, I don't know. But France has been one of these countries that have been very vocal about war, even to the point of considering sending in troops with the UK into Ukraine. Now, they would immediately be killed. They would have to be. Because if Russia allows it, then that allows this kind of nose under the camel's tent. It gets across a certain level that Putin is not necessarily serious, in which case it would allow, incentivize further escalation. Escalation that Russia cannot tolerate, cannot accept. The attack Adams missiles, the Storm Shadow, and the Scout missiles, when Putin dropped the Oreshnik in order to make his point, it should get across a few things to people. A, if we didn't pull out the INF, the International, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles Treaty, or the near missiles, or whatever they call it, but basically limiting certain missiles that are being created and being used. That missiles wouldn't exist if they didn't pull out the INF, or at the very least it would have never been used. B, Russia has limited itself in regards to how it fought Ukraine. It wasn't like the US going into Iraq or Syria where we are going to just destroy it all. We are going to destroy cities. We're going to blow up everything. That's not the way they engage this. Kiev is living, I'm not going to say normally, because of all sorts of cemeteries, but all intents and purposes, it wasn't necessarily completely obliterated in the way that that demonstration of that missile shows that it could have been obliterated several times over. They have decided to fight this in a very specific way. And that way hasn't necessarily been, a slaughterhouse, even though they have made a specific interest in destroying the Ukrainian military. I'm saying that the Oreshnik makes it clear that they were fighting this with one arm tied behind their back in some way. They were doing a limited campaign that expanded every so much as NATO dumped more weapons, missiles, bullets, guns, and everything else into the country. It is clear at this point, though, that they've lost, meaning Ukraine. Despite the fact that they have lost, you still get Antony Blinken coming out saying this. I mean, I find this to be outrageous because from my point of view, the military of Ukraine has been destroyed like 3 times, completely obliterated. They had like 1 million men. Zelensky is trying to tell people, well, we've lost less than 100,000. Less than 100,000. We've lost less than 100,000. Okay, not so much. Not so much. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians, hundreds of thousands of thick-neck men laying dead in the ground, taking their last dump on the shores or on the borders of Ukraine. I'm saying Zelensky and these people have gotten all of these people killed. And I still ask the question, for what? Why on earth did all of these people die? And ultimately, it's going to be for naught. And I would even go so far as to say less than naught, because this is not a situation where they were able to hold the line. No, not only did hundreds of thousands get killed, you also had Ukraine shrink by 25% of territory that they effectively lost. That doesn't take into account the economy is in a toilet. It doesn't take into account that they can't keep the lights on. And it doesn't take into account the number of people that fled Ukraine as a result of the war. When I point out Ukraine is dying, I mean that in a literal sense. And Blinken, who's failed miserably at everything he's touched anywhere around the world, is comically bad at his job. I mean, keep in mind, he's supposed to be the State Department, not necessarily Department or Secretary of Defense. In fact, they often use CIA Director William Burns because William Burns is effectively better at his job. But whatever. Blinken, who's a sociopath and is bad at his job, sociopath nonetheless, tells Ukraine, hey, we can give you more money, but we need you to put out your kids to carry those guns. And you are resisting doing that. So we need you to get those kids. And I'm calling them kids because I'm in my late 40s. They're talking about the teenagers, which I consider to be kids. We need those kids to go out and fight and die.
We're committed
for
to
losing war. Effectively, the Hitler Youth rerun with this sociopath.
And finally, mobilization. This is critical because even with the money, even with the munitions, there have to be people on the front lines to deal with the Russian aggression. Ukraine has hard decisions to make about further mobilization, but these are necessary decisions. We have a commitment, though, for every person, every soldier that Ukraine mobilizes. We're committed to making sure that they have the training and the equipment they need to effectively defend the country. And again, that's what we focused on. Going forward, as I said, Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership, but we're focused on this in a practical way. We set up a dedicated
Ukraine is not on the path to NATO membership. They're on the path to being destroyed. He's lying through his teeth. The entire premise, the entire point of this war had to do with Ukraine being a neutral state. Neutral. Now, apparently, there were talks about Austria hosting a peace conference. Now that's interesting because, as my ex would point out, Austria is neutral. By constitution, they are neutral. And there's something to be said about if Ukraine had that level of neutrality that Austria has, that this would end, this would stop. The issue with Ukraine is that other countries wanted to put their hands on it, just like the issue with Taiwan is that the US wants to put its hands on it. So Taiwan, a country that's supposed to be neutral, I'm sorry, not a country, it's supposed to be part of China, and even it's part of China, even under our own point of view, meaning the US point of view is the one China policy. And yet we salami slice the one China policy. And in doing so, go with these movements that wants to seek independence, which is a full, bright red line for China. We know it is a bright red line for China, which is exactly why we do it. I'm saying the same thing is true for Ukraine. Ukraine, being a neutral country, is a country that is not at war. Ukraine, being under auspices of the US, or for that matter, NATO, after that country is overthrown, is a pathway to conflict. If Ukraine is neutral, then a lot of this issue goes away. But that's not what we want. We want it under the auspices of the West. We want it as a platform that is on the Russian border to attack Russia. It's that straightforward. Now, we could say unprovoked, they're out of their mind. Daniel Lazar even pointed out it is not unprovoked. It was obviously provoked. What I'm trying to get here, though, is a war that is lost, fully lost, where Ukraine is losing more territory and losing it faster every day, according to the New York Times. Blinken says, send in your children, send in your kids, send in your women. When people point out this is fought to the last dead Ukrainian, they seem to be accurate in their assessment. I'm waiting on Jordan. I haven't seen him. He's supposed to be here at 9 a.m. I hope he doesn't blow me off. Either way, John Kiriakou will be here at 9:30. So definitely don't leave. We're still going to get more interviews coming up. One thing I want to bring up, Whoopi Goldberg. I have been blown away at the way that some of these people have been dealing with the fact that Joe Biden lost. Oh, I'm sorry, Kamala Harris lost. And in her losing, not wanting to accept reality for what it is, not wanting to change, falling into this notion of delusion that Kamala Harris, apparently, according to them, ran a flawless campaign. Charlemagne the God, who is a big supporter of Kamala Harris, goes on to The View. Now, Whoopi Goldberg, who in the past said, my vagina is closed, nobody gets this nookie. Whoopi Goldberg, who said that Joe Biden pardoning Hunter Biden was not really a lie anymore. She said she doesn't consider it a lie, despite the fact it was a flat lie. Charlemagne comes on to the show, and he gets asked questions by The View that they don't like his answer for, and Whoopi gets involved. This clip is utterly hilarious. This is Charlemagne, who was a big Kamala Harris supporter, getting into a fight on The View about whether Joe Biden lied, cynically so, and pardoning his drug-addicted, tax-dodging, porn and prostitute-loving Hunter Biden.
After repeatedly saying he would never do it. And a lot of people are saying that it's hypocritical, et cetera, as if the other side doesn't do it. But what's your reaction to it?
I mean, I think all of the criticism is valid because, Democrats stand on this moral high ground all the time. And, they act so self-righteous. The reality is he didn't have to say anything in regards to whether or not, his son wanted to be pardoned. He could have said, hey, man, I'm not focused on that right now. But since they were calling Trump a threat to democracy and they were saying that, nobody's above the law, but they were speaking about him, that's what they were running on. So when he kept saying things like, nobody's above the law, I respect, the jury's decision in regards to my son, he didn't believe that. But he didn't have to volunteer that lie to begin with.
I'm going to stop you for a second.
Uh-oh.
Only because you don't know that it was a lie. We don't know why he changed
You
his
really think he just changed his mind over Thanksgiving weekend all of
No,
a sudden?
I'm going to tell you what I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think he changed his mind because he got sick of watching everybody else get over.
Joe Biden changed his mind because he got sick of watching everybody else get over. Get over. Really? Really? The president of the United States that has lied over and over and over again, whether it was about Israel, whether it was about Ukraine. Joe Biden has lied all throughout this administration. And he was the one that saw people get over the president of the United States. Look, if you were talking about a gangbanger on the street that was going to school every day, and he saw Pookie and Yam Yam slinging crack and dope and driving in expensive cars, and he's like, God, man, why am I busting my ass at McDonald's? And why am I busting my ass at this college and school? I could just sling dope like Pookie and Yaya and get all of this money and the women and everything else. Why am I doing this? That I get. It's unfortunate, but that I get. If you are a cop and you're watching your partners and other policemen stealing, let's say drugs, money, selling it, and they're getting all of this extra money, you got bills that's not going anywhere, then okay, on some level I get it. I think it's wrong, it's corrupt. You should go to jail for that because you're supposed to be above it. But I get you're in a difficult spot and you're seeing people get over, and you get sick of seeing people get over. And so you start to make choices that are illegal, that aren't necessarily the most moral or ethical, but you're doing it because there's something out of it that you're getting, that you think the system is fundamentally unfair and that other people are using and manipulating the system for their own ends. That I get. The president of the United States, who had a crackhead kid in a case that was just sitting there for years that they didn't want anything to do about, the same president that they've used and leveraged his name in order to maximize their own profit and wealth over the years that Joe Biden continuously lied about. Joe Biden was the same person who said, I had no idea anything about Hunter Biden's businesses. And then you find out after the fact, in some of the text messages from the laptop from hell, that Joe Biden was at those meetings, or at the very least hanging out with Hunter and his business partners. Now, as I pointed before, corruption is not this comic book ridiculousness where you're going to find a letter where Hunter Biden and Joe Biden says, I am now going to get X amount of money from you, or I am now talking to your business partners about how can I make a huge amount of money. No, it's not that. It's, I am sitting here with you. We don't have to talk about anything. We could talk about sashimi. We could talk about tiddlywinks. It could be anything. We could just sit there in silence for 30 minutes. You see the VP and you know immediately that this guy has heft. Meaning it's the very existence of Joe Biden that allows them to maximize their profit, to get money, to get these resources that allows Hunter, or for that matter, Joe Biden and his brother, to maximize their profit at Joe Biden's expense using his name. If anybody is getting over, it's Biden Inc. And Whoopi Goldberg is so in this democratic context of looking at the world that this was a flawless campaign. Running around with Liz Cheney was a great idea in order to bring out the base. Perfectly flawless. So flawless that people only could be racist and misogynistic. That's the only reason Kamala Harris lost. That is her thinking because she's a Democrat and she's insulated by a certain amount of wealth. And so the difficulties that most people experience in their life, the working people, as Whoopi Goldberg says, she's a working person. Okay, you work. You do a job on The View where you get to sit and run your mouth for an hour, give or take. That's not the same reality that most people deal with when a $500 bill is a disaster, when a parking ticket is horrific because you know that you barely have the money to get from point A to point B, and now you have this extra expense that is being paid. That is not the same existence that other people are living through. And because Whoopi Goldberg doesn't live that life, she can come over here and say, my vagina is closed because Trump won. You can't get into this vagina. No, you can't. Like, this is nonsense. But this is Whoopi Goldberg. And so from her point of view, well, Biden was able to, he's sick of people getting over. And because he's sick of people getting over, he's going to pardon his son. It wasn't a lie. He didn't cynically tell people that I'm not going to pardon my kid. I'm not going to pardon my kid. He didn't do that. He didn't do that. He did it at the very end, out of the blue. He changed his mind because he got tired of seeing people get over. This is outrageous. Outrageous. Whoopi Goldberg has been sitting here saying this nonsense with these other kooks from The View for the last year or so. She is one of the worst people in regards to giving political dialogue because she makes it up as she goes along. She's just a Democrat. She's part of the cult. And being part of the cult, she can't see outside of herself into the rest of the world and understand why they lost. Charlemagne the God is trying to explain this on some level to him, and she can't even accept what Charlemagne is telling her, despite the fact that everything Charlemagne is telling her is perfectly and completely true. Whoopi, outrageous. Outrageous. It's bad enough you've shut your vagina down, but now you're pulling this nonsense. I want to bring in my guests. John, thank you for coming a bit early.
My pleasure.
Because my other guests apparently didn't show up, so you are.
Oh, that sounds familiar.
How you doing today, man? You doing all right?
I'm okay, thanks. How are you?
I am doing great. John, you're easily one of my favorite people to talk to.
Oh, thank you.
You have led such a colorful, interesting, at times painful life. But nevertheless, it has led to, like I said, colorful life. The reason I want you in, I've been focused on what has been taking place in Syria, where Turkey, the US, even Israel have put money, resources in having jihadists reignite, come out of Idlib screaming with a full-blown military of terrorists. I'm sorry, freedom-loving terrorists.
Freedom fighters.
Yeah, freedom-loving, right. Freedom-fighting terrorists who are chopping off heads as they go along. And we back this stuff. We pay for this stuff. These guys are driving in American armaments, weapons like tanks and whatnot. Why? Go back for us into the way that the CIA has ingratiated itself into these Al-Qaeda groups in order to get these groups to fight for America. And how is this even done? Like, meaning, how does the CIA get in contact with a terrorist? Like, who are they even talking to in order to get their hands on it? Is this just going through Turkey and Turkey talks to the terrorists? How does this work in practice?
Yeah, in part. There are several different ways to do it. And this is we should preface this, Jamal, by saying this is a very complicated situation. But the easy part is that the United States is wrong. So let's talk about that. The way you get in touch with a terrorist group is multifold. Number one, you go through the Turks. Number two, you might have a recruited asset that you then send to the leadership. Number three, maybe you've captured some of these guys and you sit down and you say, look, here's our position. And then you lay it out that you want to actually cooperate, work, finance, arm their organization. So there's several different ways to do it. Now, I said it was complicated for a number of reasons. Number one, the United States does not have any genuine national interests in this fight, right? I mean, let's just call a spade here. Syria doesn't have any appreciable amount of oil. Number one.
I am going to quibble with that just a little bit. From the U.S. perspective, I think we're looking at this as a global conflict, and these are just fronts. Like if we were in the Second World War,
but we shouldn't though. But we shouldn't look at this as a global conflict. Is my point. Number one. You know what? Let me tell you a very quick little story. In 2000, my two oldest sons wanted me to take them to Madison Square Garden to see a WWE professional wrestling match. So I took them. I hated it. I didn't understand any of it. And I said to them finally about 15 minutes in, I don't get it. Which one's the good guy? And my oldest son said, "That's just it, Dad. There is no good guy." And that's the situation in Syria. There is no good guy. Now, with that said, whether you like his politics or not, whether you believe that he has killed his own people or not, with gas or chemicals or whatever, and there are serious doubts that he ever did, Bashar al-Assad is the only thing standing in the way of the complete and total annihilation of Syria's quite large Christian community. All right. There are Christians in the parliament. There are Christians in the cabinet, in senior positions, including the foreign minister. And if Bashar al-Assad is overthrown by these jihadi radicals, every Christian in Syria is either going to be executed or forced out of the country. So the decision that the United States has made is this is a black and white issue. We don't like Assad. Assad is with the Russians. We're with the Kurds. The Turks are against the Kurds. The Kurds don't have the manpower to take over the whole country, but ISIS does. So we're going to ally ourselves with ISIS Light, which is the Islamic rebels, formerly known as the Al-Nusra Front, which before that was known as Al-Qaeda. Now, can you imagine? We've allied ourselves with Al-Qaeda. Now, they have promised us that they would moderate their politics. They haven't, but they have gladly accepted American weapons, American
They're still chopping off
ammunition.
heads, John.
They're
I'm
still
sorry.
chopping off heads.
Yeah.
Exactly. But this is what we've done because we don't like Assad and we don't like the fact that the Russians are in Syria propping up Assad. That's really what it comes down to.
And it's just astonishing to me. At some point you realize you're not the good guys.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of those moments where we're just not good guys. I mean, it's amazing to me that we're willing to do this just to take down Assad. And do you think this is being provoked because of what's happening in Ukraine? Like they're effectively losing so poorly in Ukraine that they've expanded the battlefield out to Syria.
Yes, I do. I do. Very, very much so. I was having a conversation with a friend about this just yesterday. And he said, you know, one of the interesting things is that there is literally no leadership in the West right now. The American president is weak. The Canadian prime minister is weak. The British prime minister is falling on his face. The French government just collapsed yesterday.
Yeah.
The German government is in the process of collapsing. There's just no leadership in the West. And so what happens in a situation like that is that the U.S. government flails around looking for a quick and easy war in which it can make an impact and come out looking more strongly.
Mm-hmm.
Syria is not the way to do that. But in Washington, nobody seems to either understand or to care.
But why do they think that, though? I mean, like, for example, and let me get your take on this. When you would think, or at the very least in the old days, that there was a strategic overarching plan when they're looking at the world and looking at the globe. That doesn't seem to be the case here. It seems like they sleptwalked into Syria thinking, well, we're in the West, we have economic and military domain, so we can tell the Russians that we can totally win this fight in Ukraine. There didn't seem to be any planning on it. They seem to just fell ass backwards into it.
Well, let me interrupt you. It's akin to the Russian position during the Vietnam War, where the Russians didn't want to get directly involved. So they just armed the North Vietnamese, did it over the course of years, and finally the Americans were driven out. The American calculus is the same in Ukraine. We're not going to get directly involved. We're not going to have American troops fighting Russian troops, but we'll arm the Ukrainians to their eyeballs and just hope that they can bleed the Russians, even if it takes 20 years, and then force the Russians out. And that's actually not the way it's working out.
Yeah, that failed miserably. That didn't happen that way at all. And it seems like they've staked this idea, the reason why I quibble with this idea that it wasn't in our interest in Syria is because it seems that they're looking at this as existential from the standpoint of Western control. Like, if they lose in Ukraine, then the very purpose of NATO, the very purpose of this notion of Western controlled world also falls and dies with it. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on that, because they have escalated over and over and over again, and they don't seem to be able to accept the fact Ukraine is a loss. They just don't seem to be able to do it.
Well, because if Ukraine is a loss, then what happens to the post-war planning? I mean, the notion that you declare Ukraine a major non-NATO ally goes out the window. Ukraine can't join NATO as an official member. Ukraine probably then can't join the European Union, although there's a precedent for that in Cyprus. But if the Ukrainians lose this conflict, it really screws things up for the Americans. And then what do? There's no plan. There's no post-war plan for what happens if Ukraine loses.
Wow. The CIA, when it's dealing with, I would imagine, so one of the things that Seymour Hersh pointed out was that during the Bush administration, that there was a turn with this idea that, okay, in order for us to get Iran, we need to get Syria. And so back during the George Bush administration, they started working with terrorist organizations to try to make connections with those organizations with the idea of creating a resistance against Assad, or for that matter, even his dad at one point, to try to either overthrow, to undercut him with the idea of moving into Iran. Now, this goes back to Wesley Clark saying that the U.S. government was trying to take down 7 governments in 5 years, which is, again, astonishing when you really think about it. I mean, the number of lives that they were willing to basically kill in order to pull this policy over with. I remember a conversation with you where you told me how you were sitting at a meeting and Dick Cheney pointed out they were going to try to go through all of those countries into Iran. That seems to be what they're doing, and it seems to be what they're still doing now. Correct me if I'm wrong, though.
No, I think that, well, you know, the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, they have these on-the-shelf or off-the-shelf policies, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got a policy that's just sitting there on the shelf to invade Iran and to overthrow the government. But it's not just Iran specific. We have off-the-shelf plans for 24 countries like that. Just in the event that all hell breaks loose, you know, or we see or there's an uprising in Iran, we can move in and take advantage of it. What you're talking about is a meeting that I was in the night before we invaded Iraq. And it was General Tommy Franks, who was the commander of Central Command in Tampa, giving his final pre-attack briefing, in which he said that we're going to cross the border in the morning, and if all goes as planned, he said, we can be in Tehran by August. This was the end of February 2003. Of course, that didn't happen because there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the Middle East, and as we've come to learn, of other countries around the world, where we're not greeted as liberators. We're greeted as invaders and occupiers. And so we're resisted. They're not going to throw flowers at us, which is what one of the senior directors at the National Security Council said in that meeting. When we cross the border, they're going to throw flowers at us. No, they're not. They're going to throw hand grenades at us to try to stop us from invading and occupying their country. Mm-hmm. So it's the same situation now. Yeah, I made a point on a show the other day, and I'm going to stick by it. The Iranians hate Donald Trump. Donald Trump hates the Iranians. Donald Trump murdered Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Al-Quds force. And there's a very special kind of hatred of Donald Trump in Iran. With that said, there are credible reports that Elon Musk met with the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations 2 weeks
Now,
ago.
do you believe that? Because Iran said that didn't happen.
I do, 100%. I do.
Okay.
You can't hide a meeting like that.
So they're denying it for public consumption, not
absolutely.
Okay.
And the reason I think that it happened is because you remember the old phrase, only Nixon could go to China.
Right.
Right? Richard Nixon had spent his entire adult life attacking Chinese communism. And then it was Nixon that went to China and made peace with the Chinese and established diplomatic relations with the Chinese. Only Trump could go to Iran. And I think something may be afoot, at least in the very preliminary stages, where, you know, maybe we've underestimated Trump, or maybe his domestic craziness has influenced us to the point where we just dismiss everything that he does. Maybe there's something to this.
Even with this radically pro-Israel contingent of lunatics that he's bringing into his administration, even with them, you think that he may be...
but what makes them any less radically pro-Israel lunatic than what the Biden administration has given us?
Hegeseth, one of those people believing that Christ is going to return in the middle of a war in the Middle East.
Right.
And if you could provoke that war and build a temple on the mound, that Jesus returns.
Correct.
I mean, you know, what that looks like in regards to policy, I agree with you, may not necessarily be that different in the way it's expressed. But that is pretty damn outrageous. And it's like, if these are the people that he's bringing into his administration, that gives me concerns in regards to how far.
But it was the same kind of people that were in the Reagan administration and the George W. Bush administration. We cycle through these evangelical lunatics every time there's a Republican administration. Nothing comes of it. You know, and this is a very long-standing evangelical position, that you've got to support the Israelis because you've got to support a policy that demands that all Jews return to Israel, because only then can Jesus come back, and it's the apocalypse and blah, 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 and then the rapture, and then everybody that's good goes to heaven. It's all nuts.
Yeah.
And not biblically based, by the way.
They believe it, though.
The word rapture never appears in the Bible anywhere. It's made up. It's a late 19th century invention of American Baptists. Even European Baptists don't believe in the rapture.
Interesting. I'm curious from your take, how is the CIA involved in all of this stuff? Like, meaning...
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. This is one of those situations, Jamal, where the CIA does as it's told. Remember, the CIA is the CIA is not a policy agency; it's a policy support agency. And so, if the policy coming out of the White House is that the CIA should, you know, make nice with Al Qaeda or with ISIS, then they make nice with Al Qaeda or ISIS. If the position of the White House is that it works along with the government of Turkey to encourage Islamic radicals to take Idlib and Hama,
that's what it does.
Then that's what it does. Yeah, it does.
How are they paid? Like, meaning, when the CIA goes to some of these groups, thick beards, warriors of Allah that are free democracy-loving terrorists.
Yes.
At some point, they're getting paid. They're driving around in military beasts. They're carrying, you know, these special weapons. They're getting training from the Ukrainians in regards to drone warfare. I mean, like, this is a full, like, hundreds of thousands of thick bearded men going into war. How on earth does the CIA get money appropriated from Congress to give? And
no. Oh, no. Let me, I'll correct that first and then answer your question more specifically. The black budget is never delineated. The appropriations are never delineated. It's just a number. And then once the number is approved by Congress, the CIA spends it in any way they want. So there's no line item that says...
No, there's no oversight at all to this?
The Gang of Four, the chairman and vice chairman of the two oversight committees will have access to the information, but even the other members of the committee won't have access to the information.
Just the number.
Just the number.
So the CIA says, I need $1 trillion. And they say, okay, here you go.
All right. And then they'll whisper into the ears of the chairman and the vice chairman of the House and Senate committees what the number's for. And then they just go like this. So, number one. Number two, I'm fond of saying, I've been saying for 20 years, 30 years, intelligence is a cash business. I'm not joking with you tomorrow when I say we were throwing money out of the side of helicopters in Afghanistan. I drove from Islamabad to Lahore in 2002 with $2 million in cash in duffel bags.
Are you serious?
I did indeed. Yeah, it's a cash business. You deal in cash. Now it's changing where you can deal in Bitcoin. Nobody's tracing Bitcoin. It's not possible to trace Bitcoin. You just hand somebody a thumb drive, a digital wallet, and you say, knock yourselves out. It's that easy.
Oh, John, that is, I mean, I guess is how it would have to be on some level, right? Otherwise you can trace it.
Exactly.
But it is a little disturbing that somebody is taking duffel bags of money and say, all right, here you are. Now you're well paid. Go buy this gun. Go buy this.
Well, listen, when we thought we had identified the location of Abu Zubaydah, we knew that this was going to be a big and expensive operation. And so I put out a cable region wide and I said, I need $10 million in cash. And so one station sent $1 million, a small station sent 200,000, another station sent 2 million. It was all in cash, and it's flying in diplomatic pouches. And I put it all in a duffel bag, and then I drove with a colleague to Lahore, and we started buying real estate. We bought 2 houses to use as safe houses and interrogation centers. We're throwing money at Al Qaeda people to rat out their colleagues. We're buying guns and battering rams and ammunition and satellite dishes and night vision goggles. And, that's just the nature of the job.
And so when we were working with Turkey, for example, at that point, Turkey takes this expense. And
Turkey will take this expense. We will reimburse them every cent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm sorry. I just got to wrap my head around that. Like, there's so much money that is just sloshing around in cash that is paying people for disreputable actions. All right. So they call out, there's a number that comes up, even though they don't exactly know what the number is for. Congress has to pay money for that. That money is effectively given in cash, and that cash is spread around to whoever is going to be involved in the operation. All right. So then at that point, though, how does the CIA get them to do X or Y? I guess at this point, this is a conversation with Turkey. Turkey is our intermediary on this, with Erdogan having his own objectives.
The objectives have to coincide. The national interests have to coincide. The Turks have to want exactly the same thing that the Americans want. Because if they don't, it's not going to work, and you're going to have to go it alone.
But in this case, they do.
In this case, yes, the national interests are identical. Not to say that it's the right thing to do, but the national interests are identical. We hate Assad. The Turks hate Assad. Here's a chance for us to overthrow Assad. Now again, if you're an Israeli, I think the Israelis are making a serious mistake here.
Well, they just want chaos. They just want
they want chaos.
Yeah, they just want fighting each other.
Which over the course of a couple of weeks might be a good thing if you're Israeli, because it'll distract the bad guys while they fight each other. But the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And Assad has never been a threat to Israel. Never. But what happens if ISIS is in charge in Damascus?
That's what I was going to say. If the government falls, meaning if all of these people, if the U.S., if the Turks, if the Israelis get what they want, and Assad falls, and you get this caliphate over all of Syria, where all of the Christians are killed, all of the other groups, Muslim groups that they don't like are killed, beheaded, then what?
Exactly. I've been to Damascus. I don't know if you ever have been, but I was able to go to a working synagogue in Damascus, right? There's a community of Syrian Jews. They are perfectly free to practice their faith as they see fit. They're loyal to the Assad government because it respects freedom of religion, believe it or not.
Safe. Yeah.
It keeps them safe. There are churches all over Syria. I went to Sunday liturgy at a Greek Orthodox cathedral in Damascus. There are Catholic churches in Damascus. Well, if Assad's overthrown, everybody's dead. And they're going to bulldoze, these ISIS and Al-Qaeda people are going to bulldoze the churches. They're going to bulldoze the synagogues. Everybody's either going to be killed or driven out of the country. And then what are the Israelis going to do when they've got an Al-Qaeda or ISIS-led government right on their border?
I know, but Al-Qaeda never attacked Israel.
Because it's never had the ability to. Remember, it killed Jews in India in the Mumbai attacks. Back in, what was it, 2008, I guess. But they never had proximity to Israel to attack Israel. If they're right on the border, you know, the sky's the limit.
Is the thinking that, okay, well, we can't militarily attack Assad. We can't create a justification for the U.S. or anybody else to attack Assad in that way. However, jihadists, head choppers, they're fair game.
Sure.
We can attack them, and the new government that we put into place will be a patsy and an ally of the U.S., Israel, and be antagonistic to Russia.
Yeah.
Is that the thought? That
is the thought.
Okay.
And the Nusra Front, now called the Jabhat
HTS or something.
Yeah. Hayat Ansar, I forget now. Whatever they're calling themselves today.
They keep changing these names.
They have a policy of promoting the notion that they are moderates. They're not moderates, right? They're head choppers, as you say.
They're head choppers.
But they have successfully convinced the United States, or maybe the United States wants to believe that they're moderates, so that as we arm them and finance them, we can sleep at night.
But then they know that's not true. I mean, like, I don't believe for a moment that the U.S. I think these people are sociopaths, meaning many in the U.S. They have to know.
Yes, they do.
They have to know.
They know. But at the same time, they think that they are so smart and so good that when Assad's overthrown, they can successfully convince these radicals to truly moderate and work with us in the international community. And remember, there's a bigger fight here. This is the Americans versus the Russians. It just happens to be in Syria.
Yeah, it's just another front in this kind of conflict. Is there an open line between the Russians and the U.S. in Syria?
No, not in Syria specifically. There is an open line from the Pentagon to the Russian Ministry of Defense. But Ambassador Antonov, the recently departed ambassador to the United States, said that it's essentially defunct. There's no communication.
That's so dangerous. So I went to the Putin-Biden summit. I was covering that for the network. And I remember being, I guess at this point, naive and somewhat optimistic, because it seems at the time that Joe Biden and Putin were saying the same thing. Like, they were like literally, and the press was attacking Joe Biden because of it. Like, what do you mean you didn't read him the Riot Act? You know, this type of stuff. Yeah. And Biden starts screaming at a reporter at one point saying, "You don't understand." Trying to get across to the reporter, look, we're dealing with nuclear powers here. We need to have some level of communication in order to know what each other is doing, so we don't necessarily make any mistakes in our, like, that we don't mispredict what the other one is doing. Okay, well, that's out the window now, correct?
Yeah, it's out the window. There's no negotiation. There's no communication. There's no hope for any kind of forward progress in bilateral relations. It's just not happening.
What about through the back door? What about William Burns? Give me your take on Burns. Burns seemed to be a better diplomat than Antony Blinken.
Oh, yeah. There's no comparison. I know both Bill Burns and Tony Blinken. I've known Tony Blinken for years, actually. Not well. We're not buddies or anything, but I've known him for a very long time.
He seems like a lunatic.
No. He's a lovely guy. He's just in
Blinken?
Completely over his head. Oh, yeah, he's a lovely guy.
Blinken just came out and said you need to send your kids to a losing war.
Yeah. Well, because that's his job. He's the Secretary of State. He has to promote the policy. But Tony's a very bright, Harvard-educated bureaucrat. But Tony's first job out of Harvard was as a junior legislative aide to Joe Biden. He worked his way up through the Biden Senate office. Yeah. Then he became the legislative director for Joe Biden. Then when Biden became the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Tony became the staff director. When Biden was elected vice president, Tony became his national security advisor. Then Biden had Tony installed as the Deputy Secretary of State. And then when Biden was elected president, Tony became the Secretary of State. So he literally every job he's had in his adult life since he graduated from college was with Joe Biden.
Wow.
Yeah, he's never really lived in the real world. Bill Burns, on the other hand, Bill Burns is the consummate diplomat.
Yeah.
Burns is one of these guys that was respected across party lines at the State Department, the CIA, the Defense Department, the White House. I wrote an op-ed when Burns was first named CIA director saying, finally, an adult in the room.
I saw that. I read that, I think. Yeah.
But it says a lot when you've got these extraordinarily sensitive negotiations between Hamas and the Israelis, where you don't send your Secretary of State.
Exactly.
You send your CIA director to conduct diplomacy. That says a lot about Tony Blinken, as much about Tony Blinken as it says about Bill Burns.
Tell me something else. Tell the audience something about the CIA that they don't know that they'd be surprised about.
I think there's a lot that people would be surprised about the CIA. You know, it's a group of tens of thousands of very, very bright, very patriotic people who are infected by the disease called groupthink. Mm-hmm. And they end up analyzing policy in this little tiny box. So even though these are some of the smartest people that our country can offer, they don't offer the smartest analysis. They don't influence policy the way that they probably might be able to. Mm-hmm. And you know, that old German adage that I was just following orders is really the mantra at the CIA.
Really?
Yeah.
And so
may I add one thing, Jamar?
Please.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
This is why I have always opposed military officers as heads of the CIA. Because you become a 4-star general by saying, yes, sir. Right? That's how you make it through your career.
That's your job,
yes, sir. Right. You need a CIA director who has the balls to stand up and say, Mr. President, let me tell you why that is a terrible idea. And we don't have CIA directors like that.
Policy trumps intelligence under normal circumstances.
Yeah.
Wow. John, man, thank you for this. I'm always fascinated by these conversations. Just the
it's my pleasure.
Like the idea that people sitting in a room and come up with, yeah, we're going to get all these people killed because of policy.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem to register. Like, hey, you're getting people killed. Like
we don't learn our lessons from history. You know, John Kerry famously said in 1972, do you want to be, or to paraphrase John Kerry, do you want to be the person who sends his son to die, for a lost cause at the end of the Vietnam War? And here we are, decades later, we've not learned that lesson.
Doing the same thing.
To die for a mistake.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's just astonishing. John, man, thank you for this. John Kiriakou.
My pleasure.
He is a former CIA officer. John, where are you now? Where can people find you now?
Substack. Everything I do, I put on Substack, and I am very soon in January going to begin a 50 event 90-day speaking tour of the United Kingdom.
Are you?
Yeah, starting with 4 dates in Ireland, January 31st in Belfast, February 1st in Dublin, February 3rd in Waterford, and February 4th in Cork. And then I go to five nights in London.
Now, what is the conversation going to be on?
It's a conversation with CIA officer John Kiriakou. So we can talk about anything people want to talk about.
Oh, that is fantastic. John.
But it's all on Substack. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, man. I appreciate this. All right. We have come to the end of the road. Somebody say Austria wasn't neutral. I know. It's in their constitution. I'm just being technical on that. Let's go to chats. I read these before the end of every show. Let's get it going. Pickle the pirate. When every party except the far right offers neoliberalism. Oh, can't see it. Hold on one second. There we are. That's better. When every party except for the far right offers neoliberalism, the people will vote for the far right. Why don't centrists understand this? Because centrists don't care. They think they're right. I mean, think of the Democratic Party, for example. The Democratic Party thinks it's right. It thinks that the left or far left are idiots, that they just don't know what's good for them, and that all things being equal, that they are just better, more superior, and right. I mean, talk to a Democrat. It didn't be part of a cult. Look at Whoopi Goldberg and the things that Whoopi Goldberg says. She thinks she's right. When you hear John Kerry saying we need to do something about the First Amendment, why? Because people are saying things that John Kerry doesn't like. When you hear Hillary Clinton saying they need to throw people in jail for saying things that Hillary Clinton doesn't like, because they think they're bright, smarter, more ethical, more superior, etc. It's that. It's hubris. It's the same thing that Joe Biden functions on when he's, or Blinken functions on when he's telling people that they need to send their kids to die. It's that. They don't care. They don't care. They think they're better. They think they're superior. Sparky, can or will Erdogan redeem himself for his connection with the recent Syrian invasion with the Muslim world by cutting off oil to Israel? Oh, that is the fascinating part, right? Because Erdogan has been raising his fists, screaming bloody murder. Oh, Netanyahu is Hitler. And then turns around and works with Netanyahu in order to hit Syria. And it's like, okay, so Israel has been indiscriminately murdering people, Muslims, en masse, in Lebanon and in Gaza, and is now annexing the West Bank. And you acted as if you couldn't do anything about it at all. And yet you have 150,000 democracy-loving jihadists with their knives to cut off throats at the ham, at the ready, and you sit there and didn't do anything. It looks bad, right? I don't know how he's going to square that. I mean, all things being equal, Erdogan, he called him a cunning beast, Sloboda. Yeah, he is a slippery, slimy, lying mofo that has been able to play this brilliantly. I don't know. I mean, look, man, it's ghastly in regards to what he's doing and what he's willing to do. But fact of the matter is the U.S. and Russia needs him. And it is hard to upset the relationship because you need him. And so he's been able to play one side against the other in this way. I have no idea what he's going to do in order to beef up his bona fides. He's acting like he has nothing to do with this at all. He's like, I don't know how this happened. I guess this is the Syrian people upset with this with Assad. Wait, so the guy with the machete cutting off the kid's head to the tune of hundreds, if not thousands, that guy is Syrian and part of Syria? Like, meaning he's acting like these are just free democracy-loving Syrians. Nonsense. I don't know what he's going to do to beef up his bona fides. I don't even know what the conversation is in Turkey and what Erdogan is doing. We'll see. Sparky, good question. I don't have an answer to that question, though. My only response is we will see. Sparky, it's kind of like Germany looking the other way when the U.S. blew up Nord Stream, except Putin looking the other way in the interest of Russia and BRICS, where the Germans are covering. Yes. Yeah. So Russia is doing this in a few ways. For one, Russia knows that the U.S. and Britain is on the ground and fighting. They know it. They don't say anything about it. There may be attack atoms hits in Russia. Russia may not say anything about it. Now, if there are escalations and if things are hit in a way that is obvious and well known, then you're stuck with the media reporting of it, in which case you have to respond to the fact of the media. But the reality of it is, in foreign policy, even in domestic policy, something can happen. If you don't acknowledge it, then you don't have to do anything about it per se. You may have to do stuff about it behind the scenes, but there may be stuff that is so big that you just can't acknowledge because of the consequences of it. So Israel has nuclear weapons. We know Israel has nuclear weapons. Our laws in this country force us to behave a particular way when we know one of those countries have nuclear weapons. And so we just don't acknowledge that they have nuclear weapons. We do the same thing. It goes unacknowledged. When Israel was starving, or as they starved their population, well, we have laws about how we respond to countries who are starving their population. So our response is it just goes unacknowledged. We pretend like it's not happening. Well, Russia's stuck in the same box. You need Erdogan. You do not want to go to war with Erdogan. Not that you can't beat him. Yeah, you will win. But the issue is, okay, well, what about the Black Sea? What about some of the other things of Erdogan being closer to NATO and the way that he started responding to Russia? Okay, well, that's a problem. We already have problems in regards to via Russia. Dealing with Ukraine, we do not want to create another one with Erdogan if we can help it. It's that part, right? So you have to pretend as if these head-shopping jihadists that are clearly coming in from Turkey, and look, man, there are articles going back for years talking about the Turkish relationship with these head shoppers. So for the people who are in Turkey, like, no, man, that's not happening. You're out of your goddamn mind. That's exactly what is happening. It is clear as day that that is happening. Everybody knows that Erdogan is responsible for it. But if you're Russia, it's difficult to acknowledge, even when you know it. If you look at Putin's statement in the readout from it, it is clear as day that in that statement, there is a veiled association with Turkey and these head shoppers. They can't hit it on the head, nor can it be said plainly. For one, Erdogan is denying it. There's that. I think his denial is absurd. Even in his denial, when he talks about, well, these are just Syrians. Okay, yeah, someone might be Syria, but don't give me this nonsense that they're free democracy-loving Syrians. Free democracy-loving terrorists. That's nonsense. Putin can't say it. He can't say it. Or at the very least, he can't say it yet. Sparky, good point, man. Good point. Flying boar or bear. Putin doesn't have the killer instinct like Stalin. Putin should have dealt with this in 2018 when he had the opportunity. You mean 2014 when they overthrew the government? Or do you mean 2018? What happened in 2018? There was an overthrow in 2014. I know there was a Little Green Men at some point. That might be what you're talking about in 2018. Look, man, from his point of view, he wanted to be a friend to the West. And look, you can call him naive. And, people in Russia think he's too weak in this sense. But I think he is becoming far more aware that this is a war. And you have to deal with it as such in strategic, military, economic ways. BRICS is this kind of strategic, long-term economic way of dealing with it, especially from the standpoint of bringing the world to this idea that we don't need a unipolar or a hegemon. Okay, well, that directly contradicts the U.S.'s role in the world. For you to say we do not need a hegemon comes across to other nations as, hey, we're going to work together, we're going to be friends, we're going to deal in our own currency. From the U.S., the U.S. thinks, oh my God, he's making a play. Yeah, he is. But it's a play that the rest of the world agrees with because it's a play that says we're all equals. We don't need this destabilizing source of America in the way that it operates. Yeah, it's he is dealing with us in the way that he believes is a strategic win. And the military component of it is just one component of a larger strategic fight. The fight has been expanded to all of these other places because the thought is that you're going to extend the reach of that fight, be it to Georgia, be it to Ukraine, be it to Syria. All of these involve Russia on some level. Georgia, a more of a veiled thing. But all of these involve Russia. They're expanding the battlefield. They're opening up new fronts. He is dealing with it in the way he believes it's a win. The U.S. is dealing with it in the way that they think that destabilization is a way to deal with the fact that all of these countries are trying to do something different. We'll see who wins that but I personally think the better argument is multipolarity. Been listening for a while here in rainy Ireland since I started, listening to Mark Sloboda and Sputnik, proper journalism and insight. Oh, 4x gold. Thank you, man. Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. I try to give context. I try to be honest. At least Biden didn't throw up like H.W. Bush in Japan, sparking. Can you imagine that? The president throws up or shits himself in a national forum. Keep in mind, Israel has killed many more Americans than Iran has. Remember the USS Liberty. Yes. Yes. People forget that. And people, you know what's sparky? I don't even know how many people know about the USS Liberty, where Israel has killed all of those Americans. I mean, literally just killed them, was picking them off left and right from the boat. All right. I'm going to call this a day because I have another appointment that I need to get to immediately. I want to tell all of you thank you. You can find me here Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. I will be here doing the news on the best damn morning show that you can listen to anywhere, either on radio, TV, or for that matter, on internet, the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. I will see you guys bright and early tomorrow morning. You all have a fantastic, phenomenal, awesome, best day of your life. Have a good one all. Signing off.